Hello, and welcome to Brada Tales. Tonight, we're bringing you a selection of eerie stories paired with the soothing sound of rain to help you relax and drift off to sleep. Before diving into the atmosphere of suspense, leave a comment below letting us know where you're watching from and what time it is. If these stories send chills down your spine, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Get comfortable, let the fear gradually envelop you, and tell us what kind of stories you'd like to hear next time. Settle in, we're about to begin. Have you ever held time in your hands, only to feel it slipping away faster with every heartbeat? That was the thought that gripped me as I stood in the dim light of the attic. The wooden floor creaked beneath my weight, and dust floated lazily through the air, illuminated by the thin beams of sunlight slicing through the cracks in the roof. I was there for no particular reason, just an idle wanderer exploring forgotten spaces in my inherited house. Among the cobweb-covered boxes and rusted tools, I found a clock unlike any I'd seen before. The case was a deep crimson, like dried blood, with intricate golden carvings spiraling along its edges. The hands moved silently, but there was something unsettling about its rhythm. Each tick seemed to echo in my chest, more a pulse than a sound. As I turned it over in my hands, I noticed an inscription on the back, barely visible beneath a layer of grime. I wiped it clean with my sleeve, revealing the words, "Time waits for none, except when it must." A chill ran down my spine. The room felt colder now, though I was sure I hadn't left any windows open. Curiosity got the better of me. I wound the clock, the mechanism clicking softly in response. For a moment, nothing happened, and I almost laughed at myself for expecting anything extraordinary. But then it stopped. Not just the clock. Everything. The faint rustle of leaves outside, the distant hum of a passing car, all of it ceased. It was as if the world had taken a breath and forgotten to exhale. I stood frozen, clutching the clock, my heartbeat the only sound in the suffocating silence. Then, from somewhere deep within the house, I heard it, a single, deliberate knock. My grip tightened on the clock as I scanned the room, every shadow suddenly feeling alive. The knock came again, louder this time, and closer. "Hello?" My voice barely rose above a whisper. No answer. The knock turned into a series of heavy, deliberate thuds. They echoed through the house, each one shaking the air around me. Panic clawed at my chest. I forced myself to move, my feet dragging as if the air had thickened. I descended the attic stairs, the crimson clock clutched tightly against my chest. The knocking seemed to come from the front door. As I approached, the air grew colder, and I could see my breath in front of me. My trembling hand reached for the doorknob, and I hesitated. Then, summoning what courage I had left, I yanked the door open. Nothing. The street outside was empty, the faint glow of streetlights flickering against the encroaching dusk. But as I stood there, heart pounding, I realized something was wrong. The shadows cast by the streetlights weren't static, they moved, twisting unnaturally, as if alive. I slammed the door shut and backed away, the crimson clock ticking faintly once more. My chest heaved with shallow breaths as I tried to make sense of what had just happened. But before I could process it, the clock stopped again. And this time, the silence was accompanied by a low, guttural whisper from directly behind me. The whisper froze me in place. It wasn't a voice exactly, but more like the scraping of wind against stone, rising and falling in a rhythm I couldn't understand. My breath caught in my throat as I turned slowly, every muscle in my body screaming to run. Behind me, the hallway stretched into darkness, impossibly long, far beyond the size of my modest house. The shadows twisted unnaturally along the walls, writhing like living things. And then I saw it, a figure standing at the far end, barely visible, its outline blending with the dark. "Who's there?" My voice cracked as I spoke. No answer. The figure didn't move. It simply stood, an unmoving blot against the faint light leaking in from the windows. I took a step back, my hands trembling around the crimson clock. As I did, the figure took a step forward. Its movements were slow, deliberate, each footfall eerily soundless despite the wooden floorboards. I stumbled backward, nearly dropping the clock. My mind screamed at me to run, but my legs felt like lead. The figure grew closer with each step, and as it neared the edge of the dim light, I saw its face, or rather, the lack of one. It had no features, just a smooth expanse of shadow where its face should have been. The clock ticked once. The figure stopped. For a moment, I thought I was safe. My heart pounded in my ears as I clung to the clock, its crimson surface almost warm against my skin. But then the figure tilted its head, as if studying me, and I realized the shadows along the walls were moving toward me now, flowing like ink. I turned and ran. The hallway stretched endlessly before me, twisting and bending in ways that defied logic. Doors appeared and disappeared on either side, their frames warped and melting into the walls. My feet pounded against the floor, but no matter how far I ran, I couldn't escape the feeling of being followed. The clock stopped again. This time, the silence was absolute. Even my frantic footsteps made no sound. I skidded to a halt, gasping for air, the stillness pressing against my ears like a vice. And then I felt it, cold fingers brushing against the back of my neck. I spun around, swinging the clock wildly, but there was nothing there. The hallway was empty, the shadows still and lifeless. My chest heaved as I tried to catch my breath, my mind racing to make sense of what was happening. The clock ticked once more, breaking the silence, and the hallway shifted. The walls closed in, the floor buckling beneath my feet. A door appeared ahead of me, its surface cracked and splintered. Without thinking, I lunged for it, throwing it open and stumbling inside. The room was small and bare, the walls covered in peeling wallpaper. A single window looked out onto a starless sky. I slammed the door shut behind me and leaned against it, my entire body shaking. The clock began ticking steadily again, its rhythm oddly soothing despite everything. I looked down at it, desperate for answers, and noticed something I hadn't seen before. The golden carvings along its edges had changed. They now formed a new pattern, one that looked disturbingly like the hallway I had just escaped. Before I could fully process this, the window shattered. Shards of glass rained down as the shadows poured in, coalescing into a figure that loomed over me. Its faceless head tilted once more, and a sound like distant thunder rumbled through the room. It reached for me, its hand stretching unnaturally long, and in my panic, I did the only thing I could think of. I smashed the clock against the floor. The room exploded with light, blinding and searing, and I felt myself falling through the floor, through the shadows, through time itself. When I opened my eyes, I was back in the attic, the crimson clock resting on the floor beside me, intact and ticking softly. Had it been a dream? A hallucination? I didn't know. But as I stared at the clock, I noticed the inscription on its back had changed. Time waits for none, except when you dare to break it. The attic felt different now, as though the air had thickened with something unseen, something watching. I scrambled to my feet, my hands still trembling. The crimson clock sat where it had fallen, perfectly intact, as if I hadn't just shattered it moments ago. "Enough," I whispered, my voice trembling. "You're not real." But the clock ticked in defiance, its sound steady and unyielding. I considered leaving it there, walking away and locking the attic door behind me. Maybe I could pretend this was all a bad dream. But deep down, I knew I couldn't. The clock wasn't just an object now, it was a part of me, tied to something I couldn't yet understand. Reluctantly, I picked it up again. The surface was warm, almost pulsing against my palm. As I stared at its face, the hands began to slow, the ticking growing faint. And then it stopped. The silence returned, heavier than before. I braced myself, expecting the shadows or the faceless figure to reappear. But nothing came. The attic was still, almost serene. I exhaled, feeling a flicker of relief. But the moment was short-lived. The floor beneath me groaned, the sound deep and resonant, like the earth itself was shifting. I stumbled back, clutching the clock, as the wooden planks began to warp and twist. A jagged crack split the floor, and from it came a low, guttural sound, something alive. Before I could react, the crack widened, and a thick, black mist began to pour out, coiling around my legs like smoke. The air grew colder, and the sound of whispers returned, louder this time, a chaotic chorus of voices that spoke words I couldn't understand. I tried to move, but the mist held me in place. My breath came in ragged gasps as the room around me seemed to dissolve, replaced by an endless void. And then, from the darkness, a voice emerged, clear and commanding. "Why do you run?" It wasn't the whispers. This voice was singular, deliberate, and it seemed to echo inside my mind. "I don't know what you want," I stammered, my voice barely audible. "You hold time in your hands, yet you fear it. Why?" The mist tightened around me, and the pressure was unbearable. I gritted my teeth, clutching the clock as if it could protect me. "What are you? What is this?" The voice didn't answer. Instead, the void shifted, and I found myself standing in a room I didn't recognize. It was a living room, modest and warm, with sunlight streaming through lace curtains. The scent of freshly brewed coffee filled the air. For a moment, I almost felt safe. But then I noticed the people. They were frozen in place, a man seated in an armchair, a woman standing near the window, a child reaching for a toy on the floor. Their faces were blank, not featureless like the figure from before, but devoid of expression, as if their emotions had been wiped clean. The clock began to tick again, louder than ever. And with each tick, the scene changed. The man's arm lowered, his fingers twitching unnaturally. The woman turned her head, her movements jerky, like a puppet on strings. The child's hand closed around the toy, and the sound of it scraping against the floor was deafening. I backed away, the crimson clock pulsing in my hands. The ticking grew faster, more erratic, as the frozen family began to move toward me, their blank faces turned in my direction. "Stop," I begged, shaking the clock. "Stop." The hands on the clock spun wildly, and the room dissolved once more, the figures disappearing into the void. I fell to my knees, gasping for air. When I looked up, I was back in my living room, the familiar clutter of my own home surrounding me. The clock rested in my lap, its ticking steady once more. But something was different now. The walls of the room seemed closer, the shadows darker. And in the corner, where the light didn't quite reach, I could swear I saw a figure watching me. The figure in the corner didn't move, but its presence was suffocating. I felt its gaze, if it even had eyes, piercing through me. The crimson clock ticked in my hands, each sound echoing in the silent room like a countdown to something inevitable. "What do you want from me?" I demanded, my voice trembling. The figure remained still, a silhouette of shadow and emptiness. But then, without warning, the clock stopped. The silence that followed wasn't just quiet, it was absolute. Even my breathing seemed muted, as though the world had been sealed in a vacuum. My chest tightened, and I instinctively clutched the clock closer, as if it could shield me from whatever was coming. The figure took a step forward. Its movements were slow, deliberate, and wrong. It didn't walk so much as glide, its body bending and twisting in ways that defied anatomy. My instinct screamed at me to run, but my legs felt rooted to the floor. The room around me began to shift. The walls stretched, their surfaces cracking like old paint, and the ceiling seemed to rise impossibly high. The light from the lamps dimmed until they flickered out completely, leaving only the faint crimson glow of the clock. Then came the sound. A deep, resonant hum that vibrated through my chest. It grew louder, more oppressive, until it felt like my bones would shatter under its weight. I forced myself to look at the figure, my heart pounding so hard it hurt. It was closer now, close enough that I could see the outlines of its form. It wasn't human. Not anymore. Its limbs were elongated, its fingers unnaturally thin and clawed. The featureless face seemed to ripple, as if something inside was trying to break free. And then it spoke. "Time is yours. Use it." The words weren't spoken aloud, but etched into my mind, each syllable sharp and cold. "I don't understand," I shouted, tears streaming down my face. The figure tilted its head, the motion unnervingly fluid, and raised one of its clawed hands. With a sharp, jarring motion, it pointed at the clock in my hands. The hands of the clock began to spin, faster and faster, until they were a blur. The room around me disintegrated, replaced by a kaleidoscope of images flashing before my eyes. I saw myself as a child, running through the park with a kite. I saw my mother, her smile radiant as she called me in for dinner. I saw the day I graduated, the pride in my father's eyes. And then I saw things I couldn't remember. A dark road at night, headlights cutting through the rain. A hand reaching for mine, trembling and cold. A scream, raw and desperate, echoing through the darkness. The images stopped as abruptly as they had started, and I found myself back in the living room. The figure was gone. But something had changed. The clock in my hands no longer ticked. The crimson glow had faded, replaced by an eerie stillness. And when I looked at its face, I saw that the hands were frozen at midnight. I stood there, unsure of what to do, when a new sound broke the silence, 3 sharp knocks at the front door. My heart sank. The sound was identical to the one I heard in the attic. "No," I whispered, backing away. "Not again." The knocking came again, louder this time, shaking the walls. I glanced at the clock, hoping for some kind of guidance, but it remained still, lifeless. The knocking turned into pounding, the door rattling in its frame. Summoning every ounce of courage, I moved toward the door, my hands shaking. When I reached it, the pounding stopped. I hesitated for a moment before opening it. Nothing was there. Or so I thought. As I stepped outside, I noticed something lying on the doorstep. It was a photograph, old and faded. I picked it up with trembling hands and turned it over. It was me, holding the crimson clock, standing in a place I didn't recognize. Behind me, the shadowy figure loomed, its faceless head tilted toward me. Written on the back of the photograph were 4 words. "The third stop waits." The photograph trembled in my hands. My pulse thundered in my ears, but the world around me was deathly quiet. The 4 words on the back, the third stop waits, felt like a final warning, or maybe a promise. I didn't want to go back inside. The house felt alive now, its walls pulsing faintly like a beating heart. The shadows in the windows seemed to shift, moving independently of the dim light outside. But where could I go? There was no escaping this, whatever this was. The crimson clock in my hand suddenly ticked once, sharp and loud, shattering the silence. And then it began again. Tick, tick, tick. The sound was steady, but each tick felt heavier, as if time itself was dragging me forward. I clutched the clock tightly and stepped back inside, closing the door behind me. The air was thick, oppressive. The house no longer looked like mine. The furniture was warped, the walls covered in deep, jagged cracks that seemed to breathe. The floor creaked beneath my feet, each step echoing unnaturally. The photograph weighed heavy in my pocket, but I didn't dare look at it again. My focus was on the clock, its ticking growing louder with every step I took. "Where are you taking me?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. The clock didn't answer. But it didn't need to. Ahead, the hallway stretched longer than it ever had before, the darkness at the far end yawning wide like a mouth. I felt its pull, an invisible force dragging me closer. My legs moved against my will, each step harder to resist than the last. As I neared the end of the hallway, the air grew colder. My breath came in visible puffs, and the ticking of the clock slowed, the sound now deep and resonant, like the tolling of a bell. The darkness at the end of the hall shifted. A figure emerged, its silhouette impossibly tall and thin, its limbs stretching unnaturally as it moved toward me. I froze. This time, there was no shadow to hide it, no distance to blur its form. The figure was clearer now, its body rippling like liquid, its featureless face shimmering faintly, as if something beneath it struggled to break free. The clock stopped. The figure spoke, its voice a low rumble that seemed to come from everywhere at once. "You broke the clock." "I didn't mean to," I said, my voice cracking. "I don't understand what you want from me." The figure tilted its head, its featureless face leaning closer. I could feel the cold radiating from it, an emptiness that seemed to pull the warmth from my body. "You asked for time." I started, but the words caught in my throat. And then I remembered. The night in the attic, before I found the clock. I'd sat in the darkness, staring at old photographs, wishing I could go back. Wishing I had more time with my family, with my life before it all fell apart. "You heard me," I whispered. The figure straightened, its presence towering over me. It didn't answer, but I understood now. The clock wasn't just a relic, it was a deal, a gift wrapped in a curse. The figure extended a long, clawed hand, palm up. "Return what you took." I looked down at the crimson clock, its silent face glowing faintly in the dim light. My hands trembled as I realized what it meant. Returning it might stop this nightmare, but at what cost? What happens if I give it back? I asked. I took a deep breath, every fiber of my being screaming against what I was about to do. Slowly, I extended the clock toward the figure. Its claws wrapped around it, and for a moment, I thought I saw its faceless head smile, or at least, shift in a way that resembled satisfaction. The clock began to tick again. Tick. Tick. The figure dissolved into shadows, and the world around me collapsed. When I opened my eyes, I was standing in the attic again. The clock was gone, and the air felt normal. The house was quiet, bathed in the soft light of dawn. But something was wrong. I walked through the house, every step heavier with dread. The pictures on the walls were different, faces I didn't recognize, strangers smiling in places I'd never been. The furniture wasn't mine. Even the smell of the house had changed, the faint aroma of coffee replaced by something unfamiliar. Sea shaking. The figure's silence was answer enough. I ran outside, desperate for answers. But the street was different too. The houses, the cars, the trees, none of it matched what I remembered. I didn't belong here anymore. And as I stood there, trembling on the unfamiliar street, I felt a faint tickle in my pocket. Reaching in, I pulled out the photograph. It was the same as before, me holding the crimson clock, the shadowy figure behind me. But now, there was something new written beneath the original message. Time doesn't return what it takes. Have you ever felt watched, even when no one else was around? That thought lingered in my mind as I sat alone on the beach. It was my third day here, a solo vacation meant to clear my head. The resort was quaint, tucked away on a quiet stretch of coastline. Most of the other guests preferred the pool or the bar, leaving the beach practically deserted. I had always loved the sound of waves crashing against the shore, the way the breeze carried the salty tang of the ocean. But something about this beach felt off. It started small. The first time I noticed the footprints, I didn't think much of it. They were faint impressions in the damp sand, leading from the dunes to the water's edge. They looked human, barefoot, like someone had been strolling along the shore. Except I hadn't seen anyone else all morning. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows over the beach. I followed the prints with my eyes, but they disappeared where the tide lapped against the sand. A shiver ran down my spine. I told myself it was nothing, maybe someone had been here earlier, and the waves had washed away the rest of their trail. Still, an uneasy feeling settled in my chest, like a tiny weight pressing against my ribs. The footprints appeared again the next morning. This time, they started farther up the beach, near the edge of the dunes, and wound their way down toward the water. I frowned, tracing their path with my eyes. They were different now, larger, deeper, as though the person who left them had been heavier or walking with more force. I glanced around, but the beach was empty except for the gulls wheeling overhead. "Hello?" I called out, my voice swallowed by the roar of the ocean. No answer. I hesitated, then stood and followed the prints. The sand shifted under my feet as I walked, the sound of my steps muffled. The closer I got to the water, the stronger the wind became, tugging at my hair and clothes. The footprints stopped abruptly at the shoreline, the last impression half faded where the waves licked at it. I scanned the horizon, my heart pounding. There was no sign of anyone, no boats, no swimmers, no distant figures. Just the endless expanse of ocean. That night, I couldn't sleep. The sound of the waves, usually so soothing, seemed louder, more insistent. The wind howled through the cracks in the window frame, rattling the glass. I tossed and turned, my mind replaying the sight of those footprints over and over. Who was leaving them? And why did they vanish at the water's edge? The next morning, I woke early, determined to put the mystery to rest. The sky was overcast, the air heavy with the promise of rain. I grabbed a cup of coffee and headed to the beach, my sandals crunching against the gravel path that led to the sand. The footprints were there again. This time, they were smaller, almost childlike. They zigzagged across the beach in a playful pattern, as though whoever had left them had been running. A chill crept up my spine, despite the warmth of the morning air. I glanced around, my eyes scanning the dunes and the shoreline. Nothing. I knelt beside the nearest print, studying it closely. The details were sharp, every curve of the toes, the faint arch of the foot. It was as though the impression had been made moments ago. But the sand was cool and dry, untouched by any recent disturbance. I straightened, a growing sense of unease gnawing at the edges of my thoughts. The beach felt different now, the air thick and oppressive. Even the sound of the waves seemed muted, as though the ocean itself was holding its breath. And then I saw it. Farther down the beach, where the sand met the water, something moved. It was faint, almost imperceptible, a ripple in the air, a shimmer that danced like heat haze. I blinked, and it was gone. But the footprints had changed again. Now, they were larger than ever, the impressions deep and uneven, as though whatever was leading them was limping. They led straight into the water, disappearing beneath the waves. A low rumble of thunder echoed in the distance, and I realized the wind had stopped. The beach was silent now, save for the faint rush of the tide. I stood there, frozen, staring at the last footprint as the tide slowly erased it. Somewhere behind me, I thought I heard the faintest whisper. The whisper lingered in my mind, like an echo just out of reach. I spun around, searching the empty beach for its source, but there was nothing, no movement, no shadow, no one. The sand was undisturbed except for the shifting trails of wind and those impossible footprints. I returned to my spot near the dunes, pretending I could ignore what I'd just seen. I even opened a book, trying to distract myself, but the words blurred on the page. My thoughts were elsewhere, drifting back to those deep impressions in the sand. What could have made them? They were too perfect, too detailed to be anything but human. But they weren't. Not really. The rest of the day passed uneventfully, though the unease never fully left me. By evening, the clouds had thickened, and the air felt electric. I stood on the porch of my rented cabin, staring out at the darkening beach. That's when I saw the new footprints. They were clearer now, more defined than before. They started in the same place, just beyond the dunes, but this time they didn't lead straight to the water. They circled. The trail looped and twisted, forming a spiral that grew tighter as it approached the center. It was mesmerizing, almost beautiful in its precision. But something about it made my skin crawl. I grabbed a flashlight and stepped into the growing darkness. The beam of light cut through the shadows, illuminating the sand in stark relief. I followed the trail cautiously, my footsteps crunching against the cool ground. The spiral ended near the shoreline, where the sand was wet and firm. At its center was something I knelt, brushing the sand away to reveal a smooth, black stone. It was cool to the touch, its surface polished like glass. Strange markings were etched into it, symbols I didn't recognize, their edges sharp and precise. As I held it, the wind picked up, carrying with it a faint sound, like distant laughter, soft and mocking. I stood quickly, the stone clenched in my fist. The laughter faded, replaced by the crash of the waves, but the unease remained. I looked back at the spiral of footprints. Small and dark, half buried in the earth. They were gone. The sand was smooth and untouched, as though no one had ever walked there. That night, I couldn't sleep again. The stone sat on the nightstand beside me, its dark surface catching the faint glow of the moonlight. I couldn't stop staring at it, couldn't shake the feeling that it was watching me in return. At some point, I must have drifted off, because I woke to the sound of thunder. The storm had arrived. Rain lashed against the windows, and lightning illuminated the room in brief, blinding flashes. The air was thick with the smell of salt and earth. And then I heard it. Footsteps. They were faint, muffled by the sound of the storm, but unmistakable. They started outside, near the dunes, and grew louder as they approached. I held my breath, straining to hear. The footsteps stopped just outside my door. I waited, my heart pounding. Seconds stretched into minutes, and still, nothing happened. Finally, I forced myself to move. I crept to the window and peeked through the curtain. The beach was empty, but the footprints were back. They started near the dunes, just like before, but this time they led straight to my cabin. A bolt of lightning illuminated the beach, and for a split second, I thought I saw a figure standing near the water, a dark silhouette, too far away to make out clearly. When the lightning flashed again, it was gone. The footsteps outside my door shifted. They were moving again. Toward me. The footsteps stopped right outside my door. I stood frozen in the darkness, my back pressed against the wall. My heart pounded in my chest, the sound almost as loud as the storm outside. The rain hammered against the roof, masking all but the faintest sounds. I strained my ears, listening. No footsteps. No whisper of movement. Nothing. Slowly, I reached for the flashlight on the nightstand. Its weight in my hand felt reassuring, but I wasn't sure why. I flicked it on, the beam cutting through the shadows. The door was locked. I checked it twice before I went to bed, but now I stared at it like it might swing open on its own. I didn't want to look outside, but something inside me wouldn't let it go. I took a deep breath and moved toward the door. My bare feet made no sound on the wooden floor. I stopped with my hand on the doorknob, every nerve in my body screaming at me not to open it. But I did. The wind tore at the door as soon as I cracked it open, rain splattering my face and soaking the floor. I stepped onto the porch, the flashlight trembling in my grip. The footprints were there. They started just beyond the steps, their edges sharp in the wet sand. They led away from the cabin, toward the shoreline, where the waves crashed relentlessly against the beach. The storm had erased everything else. There were no spirals, no faint trails in the dunes, just this single line of prints leading to the water. I hesitated, glancing back at the cabin. The stone still sat on the nightstand, its strange markings glowing faintly in the dim light. I thought about leaving it there, about locking the door and pretending none of this was happening. But I couldn't. I stepped off the porch and into the storm. The rain soaked through my clothes in seconds, the wind whipping my hair into my face. I followed the footprints, the sand cold beneath my bare feet. The beam of my flashlight wavered in the darkness, but I kept moving, my eyes fixed on the trail. The footprints grew deeper as they neared the water, as though whoever, or whatever, had made them was sinking into the sand. When I reached the shoreline, they stopped. I stared at the last print, my breath coming in short, shallow gasps. The tide lapped at the edges, slowly erasing it. I turned my flashlight toward the water, the beam reflecting off the churning waves. And that's when I saw it. Something was out there. At first, I thought it was a piece of driftwood floating just beyond the breakers. But then it moved, slowly, deliberately. A shadow, darker than the water around it, rising and falling with the waves. The wind howled, and for a moment, the rain seemed to pause. The ocean was eerily calm, the waves receding farther than they should. The shadow moved closer, its shape becoming clearer. It wasn't driftwood. It was a figure. The water barely reached its knees, but its face was obscured, hidden by the rain and the darkness. It stood motionless, staring at me, or at least I thought it was staring. I couldn't move. My legs felt rooted to the spot, the flashlight slipping from my hand and landing in the sand with a soft thud. The figure raised an arm, its movements slow and deliberate. It pointed toward the cabin. I turned instinctively, following its gesture. The cabin stood in the distance, its windows glowing faintly. But something was wrong. The door was open. Light spilled onto the porch, illuminating a new set of footprints leading inside. I spun back toward the water, but the figure was gone. The waves surged forward, washing over my feet and pulling at the sand around me. I stumbled back, my heart racing. The storm returned with full force, the rain pelting me ran. The sand seemed to shift beneath my feet, slowing me down, but I didn't stop. I reached the cabin and threw myself inside, slamming the door behind me. The footprints were everywhere. They crisscrossed the floor, leading to every corner of the room. And at the center of it all, the black stone sat on the nightstand, glowing faintly in the dim light. The whispers started again, louder this time. They surrounded me, filling the air with a strange, guttural language I couldn't understand. And then the door opened. The door swung open with a deafening crack, slamming against the wall. Cold air rushed into the cabin, carrying with it the scent of salt and something else, something metallic, like blood. I stumbled back, grabbing the flashlight from the floor and fumbling to turn it on. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the doorway. No one was there. But the footprints. They were fresh, wet, and leading inside. The whispers grew louder, echoing from every corner of the room. They overlapped, a cacophony of voices speaking in a language that made my head throb. The air felt heavy, pressing down on my chest, making it hard to breathe. My skin and the wind howling like a living thing. I turned toward the black stone. It was glowing brighter now, the strange symbols etched into its surface pulsing with an otherworldly light. The whispers seemed to emanate from it, filling the small cabin with their oppressive presence. And then I saw it. A shadow moved in the corner of my vision. I whipped the flashlight around, but there was nothing there, just the empty room, the furniture bathed in harsh, flickering light. The shadow moved again, closer this time. It wasn't just a shadow. It was something in the shadows, its form shifting and rippling like smoke. The whispers grew louder, the language twisting and bending, each word grating against my mind. I clutched my head, trying to block it out, but the voices only grew stronger. "Stop!" I shouted, my voice cracking. The whispers fell silent. For a moment, the only sound was the pounding of the rain against the windows. The room felt still, too still, like the world was holding its breath. Then the figure stepped forward. It emerged from the shadows, its form barely solid. It was tall and thin, its limbs elongated and unnatural. Its face, or what passed for a face, was smooth and featureless, a blank slate that seemed to drink in the light. It raised a hand, pointing toward the stone. I shook my head, my body trembling. "What do you want?" I whispered. The figure didn't respond. It simply stood there, its hand outstretched, waiting. The symbols on the stone flared brighter, casting the room in an eerie red glow. The whispers started again, but this time they were different, slower, more deliberate. They were speaking to me. The words were still incomprehensible, but their meaning seeped into my mind like poison. I understood what it wanted. It wanted me to take the stone. "No," I said, backing away. "I'm not touching it." The figure didn't move, but the room seemed to shift around me. The walls bent inward, the floor rippling like water. The air grew colder, each breath burning in my lungs. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. The figure took a step forward. I stumbled back, my heel catching on the edge of the rug. I fell hard, the flashlight skittering across the floor. The beam swung wildly, landing on the stone. It was vibrating now, a low hum filling the air. The light from the symbols pulsed in time with the whispers, each flash brighter than the last. The figure loomed over me, its hand still outstretched. I reached for the flashlight, but my fingers brushed against something else, something smooth and cold. The stone. Before I could pull away, the symbols flared one last time, and the room was swallowed in blinding light. I woke to silence. The storm was gone. The air was still, the cabin bathed in the soft light of dawn. The stone was gone. So were the footprints. I stood slowly, my body aching. The cabin was exactly as I had found it when I arrived, clean, untouched, normal. But I wasn't the same. The whispers were gone, but their echo lingered in my mind, a constant, nagging presence. And when I looked at my hands, I saw faint, glowing symbols etched into my skin, symbols I knew I would never be able to erase. I stepped outside, the sand warm beneath my feet. The beach stretched out before me, calm and empty. And then I saw them. Footprints leading away from the cabin. This time, they weren't heading to the water. They were heading inland. And they were mine. I stood frozen at the edge of the porch, staring at the footprints in the sand. They were fresh, wet with dew, and unmistakably mine. But there was something wrong with them, something wrong about the way they fell, the way they seemed to reach forward, as if they were already heading somewhere. The beach was still, as it had always been in the early morning. The storm was gone, but its eerie aftermath clung to the air, cool, damp, and unnaturally quiet. I didn't feel the warm sunlight on my skin the way I expected to. The footprints curved inland, disappearing into the shadowed path of the dunes, where the soft earth at SWI didn't want to follow them. I knew I shouldn't. But somehow, my feet moved before I could stop them. It was as though something was drawing me forward, pulling me into the same strange pattern I had tried so desperately to avoid. With each step I took, the sand seemed to shift beneath my feet, almost as if the earth itself were alive, adjusting to my every move. My heart raced. The echoes of the whispers, those haunting, incomprehensible voices, still reverberated in my mind. As I walked, I could almost hear the hum of the stone again, that same low vibration I had felt in the cabin. It wasn't real. It couldn't be real. But the feeling was real. It was there, in the back of my mind, urging me forward. The wind shifted, carrying with it the salty scent of the sea, but I didn't hear the usual sounds of the beach, no birds, no crashing waves. Just silence. I reached the edge of the dunes, where the sand gave way to a sparse patch of grass and rocky terrain. The footprints continued, leading toward a small, dark grove of trees. I hadn't seen this part of the island before. I hesitated, my breath shallow. The trees were thick, their trunks gnarled and twisted, as if they had grown in unnatural shapes. The air grew colder as I stepped beneath their canopy, and I could feel the weight of the silence pressing down on me. The footprint stopped abruptly at the edge of a clearing. The ground here was soft, the earth dark and damp. A small stone circle lay at the center, and I could feel the pull, the familiar hum from deep within the ground. The stone. It was buried here. I knew it. I stepped forward, my hand shaking as I reached down to brush away the dirt. As my fingers brushed against something hard and cold, a jolt ran through me. The stone was here, just beneath the surface, waiting for me to uncover it. I pulled it free, feeling its weight in my hands. The symbols glowed faintly once again, pulsing in time with my heartbeat. And then, before I could react, the ground trembled. The trees around me swayed violently, their leaves rustling like whispers, too loud, too fast. The wind picked up, whipping around me, pulling at my clothes and hair. The earth seemed to shift beneath me, the air thick with static. And then I heard it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps. Along the trail just a few steps beyond. But not mine. They were coming from behind me. I spun around, but there was no one there. Only the trees, bending and twisting as though they had a life of their own. But the footsteps, they were closer now. Suddenly, the air grew colder, and I could see my breath in front of me. A figure emerged from the shadows. It was the same figure from the water. Tall, thin, and featureless, it moved slowly, its long limbs stretching unnaturally with each step. It was the same thing, but this time there was no mistaking its intent. It was coming for me. I backed away, the stone still in my hand, its symbols pulsing faster, brighter. The figure didn't stop. It didn't speak. But its presence was enough to paralyze me. My feet refused to move. The ground beneath me felt solid, but the air around me pressed down, pulling me closer to the figure, drawing me into its orbit. I could feel its gaze, even though it had no face. And then, just as it reached out toward me, I realized something. I had done this. I had summoned it. I had taken the stone, followed the footprints, and now it was here. And I had nowhere to run. The figure's hand touched my shoulder, its fingers cold as ice. I gasped, but there was no sound. The world around me blurred, the light fading, and the whispering voices returned, louder this time, louder than ever. They spoke to me. They spoke in the same language, but now their words were clear. You have come. You have returned. I tried to scream, but no sound came. The figure pulled me into the darkness, and the stone burned in my hand, its symbols swirling in an endless, terrifying loop. And then everything went quiet. The storm had returned, but this time it was just a storm. The wind howled across the empty beach, the sound of the waves crashing against the shore, but the clearing was silent. The footprints in the sand had disappeared, and the stone was gone. The island was still, but I was no longer the same. I left the beach behind, the memory of those footsteps, the whispers, the figure, everything still haunting me. The island had taken its toll, and I couldn't escape the feeling that it would always be with me. The footsteps would always find me. It was the creak of the old floorboards that caught my attention first. A sound so faint, so subtle, it could have been anything, a draft, the house settling, or perhaps just my imagination. But it wouldn't leave me alone. I had just moved into the old townhouse a few weeks ago. The landlord, an elderly man with a voice like gravel, had assured me that the building was perfectly safe. Still, there was something unsettling about it. The apartment was spacious, tucked away in a quiet corner of the city, with antique furnishings that seemed to hold secrets of their own. The walls were thick, the windows small, and the air always a little too cool. I was used to old houses. My family had lived in one for years, but this place felt different. It felt forgotten. One evening, as I was unpacking my things in the basement storage room, I noticed something odd. The far wall, where the concrete met the old wood beams, had a strange, faint marking. At first, I thought it was just dirt, a stain of some sort, but when I got closer, I saw that it was an outline, faint but definite, of a door. I brushed my fingers along the wall. It was cold, colder than the rest of the basement. I pressed harder, feeling for any sign of a hidden latch, but there was nothing. It was just a wall, plain and ordinary. Except that it wasn't. I left the basement that night with a nagging feeling, something stirring deep in my gut. I couldn't stop thinking about that door. The next day, I decided to take a closer look. I found the old metal flashlight I had buried in a box and brought it down with me. The basement was darker now, and the air was musty with the scent of mildew and aged wood. The sound of water dripping from the pipes above added to the eeriness of the space. The strange outline on the wall was still there, almost waiting for me. It was as though the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for me to uncover what had been hidden for so long. I ran my hand over the outline again, and this time I felt it, just a slight shift, a key in the wall where none should have been. My heart began to race. I backed away from the wall, my mind swirling with questions. What was behind that door? What was the point of hiding it? The air felt thick with a kind of electricity, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been watching me. Something that didn't want to be found. I stood there for a long time, just staring at the outline, weighing my options. But curiosity got the better of me. I grabbed the flashlight, positioned it at the crack where the wall met the floor, and shoved hard against the surface. It took only a moment before the wall gave way, a faint scraping sound breaking the silence. The hidden door creaked open, revealing a narrow passage that led deeper into the shadows. The room beyond was small and cramped, barely big enough to stand in. The floor was covered in dust, untouched for years. At the far end of the room stood an old wooden door, its frame ornate but decaying, as though it had been left to rot in the dark for decades. I couldn't see what lay beyond it, but I could feel the weight of the air pressing against me, heavy with the weight of what had been locked away. I stepped forward, the flashlight trembling in my hand. The beam flickered, and for a moment I thought I saw movement, something shifting in the corner of the room. But when I turned, nothing was there. I took another step, my breath shallow, my heart pounding. The door before me looked ancient, but something about it felt familiar. My hand reached out, brushing against the cold, splintered wood. As I touched it, a voice whispered in my mind. It wasn't a sound I could hear, but a sensation, as if the walls themselves were trying to speak. "Don't open it," the voice seemed to say, but it was too late. The door groaned as it swung open, and I stepped inside. The light from the flashlight illuminated the room, revealing faded wallpaper and rotting furniture. There were no windows, and the air was thick with the smell of decay. The room felt stifling, as if it had been locked away for a reason. I hesitated, but the room seemed to pull me forward, and my eyes landed on something in the corner, a large, dusty mirror. The glass was cracked, the frame covered in cobwebs. I couldn't help but approach it, drawn by some invisible force. As I stood before the mirror, my reflection didn't appear right away. Instead, I saw a flicker, a shadow in the corner of the glass. And then, there it was, a figure, standing just behind me. I spun around, my heart thudding in my chest, but the room was empty. Nothing was there. I turned back to the mirror. The figure was still there. It was tall, thin, its face obscured by shadow. And then, just as I was about to back away, it smiled. I froze. The smile stretched impossibly wide, the features of the face blurring, as though the figure was trying to break free from the glass. It didn't move at first, but then it reached out. Its hand came through the mirror, cold and skeletal, fingers elongated and reaching for me. I backed away quickly, but the room was changing. The walls were narrowing, the air growing heavier, the ceiling pressing down. The mirror's reflection warped, the shadows swirling into something dark and incomprehensible. I had to leave. I had to get out. But when I turned to run, the door, the only exit, was gone. I stood frozen, staring at the empty space where the door had been just moments ago. My breath came in short, sharp gasps, as if I'd just run a marathon. Panic set in. The walls were closing in, the air thickening, and the shadows in the room seemed to pulse with a life of their own. I turned in a circle, my heart hammering in my chest, trying to make sense of what was happening. The room, once cramped but at least familiar, had now become an unrecognizable maze of shifting shapes. The old wallpaper seemed to sway, the once still furniture now appeared as if it were subtly moving, its position changing when I wasn't looking directly at it. The mirror, I hadn't taken my eyes off it. That thing in the reflection was still there, grinning, its fingers twitching. I dared not approach it again, but I couldn't seem to tear my gaze away. Focus, I muttered to myself, trying to steady my breathing. I needed to think. I needed to find a way out. The door had been there, I was certain of it. It had opened into this room, but now it was gone. How could that be? How could I have walked into a room that shifted? I reached for my flashlight, the only thing that felt like it was still tethered to the real world. I clicked it on, but the beam trembled in my hand, flickering as if it, too, was being affected by whatever strange force had taken hold of the room. The light barely pierced the thick darkness, casting long, crooked shadows that seemed to stretch and shrink with every passing second. I approached the mirror again, but this time I kept my distance. The air felt colder now, almost frigid, as though something was breathing just behind me. My skin tingled with the sensation of being watched, but when I turned, there was nothing there. But there was still the figure in the mirror. It was no longer standing motionless. It was moving, slowly at first, then more deliberately. The smile on its face widened, impossibly so, until its jaw seemed to unhinge. The shadows behind it grew darker, deeper, and I could almost hear a low, guttural sound that seemed to come from within the glass itself. I stumbled back, my eyes never leaving the reflection. The figure's hand, the hand that had reached through the mirror before, was now fully extended, its fingers curling toward me like claws. The sight was enough to make my stomach turn, and I felt a wave of nausea rising. "Stop," I whispered, but I wasn't sure whether I was speaking to the thing in the mirror or to myself. I had to escape. I had to leave this room before whatever that thing was could reach me. I turned again to search for the door, my eyes darting across the now enclosing space. But still, there was nothing. Where did it go? My mind raced. I had been standing right by it just moments ago. It should have been right there. A sudden noise cut through the oppressive silence. A faint scraping sound, like metal on stone. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. The noise was coming from behind me. I whipped around, flashlight trembling in my hand, but the beam only illuminated the same four walls. The scraping sound grew louder. I began to back up, every instinct telling me to get away, to run. I stumbled, my foot catching on the edge of something. I fell hard onto the floor, the flashlight slipping from my grip and rolling out of sight. For a moment, I couldn't move. I was disoriented, my heart pounding painfully against my chest. The darkness was absolute now, and I could hear nothing but my own ragged breath. But then, I heard it again. The scraping was louder now, closer. It was unmistakable. It was coming from within the walls, as though something was scraping, clawing its way through the thin layers of wood. A shiver ran down my spine. I pushed myself to my feet, searching desperately for the flashlight. My fingers brushed against the cold concrete floor, and I felt a wave of dread wash over me as I realized I couldn't find it. I needed to see. I needed the light. I scrambled blindly across the floor, my hands grazing the wooden beams, my skin cold with sweat. The scraping continued, relentless, as if whatever was behind the walls was moving closer. My pulse raced. My thoughts were clouded with terror. What was it? What was in the walls? The scraping suddenly stopped. Silence. Absolute silence. And then I heard something else. A voice. It was soft at first, barely a whisper, but it grew louder with each passing second. My body stiffened, frozen in place as the voice seemed to echo from every direction. Leave. It was low, almost soothing in its tone. But there was something wrong about it, something chilling. I blinked in confusion, straining to hear more, to make sense of it. Leave, the voice repeated. This time, it was louder, more insistent. I wanted to obey. My body screamed for me to run, to escape, but something was holding me in place. I couldn't move. It was as though my body refused to listen to me, as if the house itself was controlling me, pulling me deeper into its twisted embrace. And then, from the corner of my eye, I saw it. The door. It had returned, or maybe it had never been gone in the first place. But this time, it was different. The frame was warped, distorted, as if the wood itself had been stretched and twisted by unseen hands. The door was not inviting, not an exit. It was a trap. A trap that I had just walked straight into. I staggered toward it, torn between the need to escape and the overwhelming force pulling me closer. The voice grew louder now, more frantic, as if pleading with me to leave before it was too late. But the door, it wouldn't let me. I reached for the door, my hand trembling, heart pounding. The air around me seemed to grow thicker, suffocating me with every breath. It felt like the walls were closing in, as though the house itself was alive, its very structure shifting, pressing in on me from all sides. The warped door seemed to leer at me, its surface rippling as if it had a mind of its own. Leave, the voice repeated, its tone now a harsh rasp. The sound of it grated against my nerves, the urgency clear in its call. I had to escape. My mind screamed at me to turn around, to run, but my body refused to obey. I stood, rooted to the spot, the door inches away. The voice had become frantic, pleading. Leave now, before it finds you. But there was no time to think. There was only the door, the distorted wood, and the feeling that something was coming from the other side. With a final, desperate motion, I forced myself to grab the handle. It was cold, unnaturally so, sending a jolt of ice through my fingers. As I twisted the knob, the sound of it grinding against the doorframe echoed in the silent room louder than anything I had heard before. It felt as though the entire house shuddered in response. The door opened with a slow creak, revealing nothing but more darkness. I stepped through, my breath coming in quick, shallow gasps. The moment I crossed the threshold, the door slammed shut behind me, the echo of it vibrating through my bones. My chest tightened, a feeling of dread swelling within me. The space I had entered was even colder than the room I had just left. The walls seemed to press in on me, and the air felt thick with something unseen, something old. The floor beneath me was uneven, covered in a layer of dust and dirt, and the faint smell of mildew lingered in the stagnant air. I could barely make out the shape of the room, but there was something unmistakable about it, a presence, a feeling that I was no longer alone. My flashlight flickered, its beam weak and erratic. I cursed under my breath, shaking it in frustration, but it barely responded. The shadows in the corners seemed to grow longer with each passing second, swallowing the light. The oppressive silence pressed in on me, and I could hear the distant sound of water dripping somewhere in the room. Then I saw it. At the far end of the room, in the dim light, a figure stood. I couldn't make out its features, but the shape was unmistakable, tall, thin, its outline blurry as if it were made of smoke. It was standing still, watching me, and for a moment, I thought I saw its head tilt slightly, as though studying me. A sudden wave of cold washed over me, and I felt the hair on the back of my neck stand up. My legs refused to move, and my breath hitched in my throat. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the figure, though every instinct in me screamed to run, to escape whatever nightmare this place had become. The figure stepped forward, moving with unnatural smoothness, its form shifting with every step, like the shadows themselves were coming to life. It was close now, and I could feel its presence pressing in on me, a cold, suffocating force. The voice was louder now, no longer a whisper, but a scream echoing in my mind. Leave. I wanted to scream. I wanted to run. But I couldn't move. The room, the house, was holding me there, paralyzing me with its grip. And then, the figure spoke. Why did you come? The voice was deep, low, distorted, like it was coming from a place far beyond the room. It didn't come from the figure's mouth. It was as though the room itself had spoken. I tried to speak, but my voice failed me. It felt as though the very air in my lungs had been stolen. I opened my mouth again, trying to find my voice, to explain, but no words came out. The figure moved closer, and with each step, the shadows seemed to grow more intense. The air grew heavier, and I could feel the weight of something pressing down on my chest. I was suffocating, but still, I couldn't move. You shouldn't have come here, the figure said, its voice growing louder, almost angry. A sudden rush of sound filled my ears, like a sharp wind, like the distant roar of a storm gathering in the distance. The figure's shape flickered, distorting, as though it were being torn between two worlds. I saw its face then, or rather, I saw what was left of it. The features were blurred, melting into a grotesque, shifting mass, but there was something deeply familiar about it. I couldn't place it. I shook my head, trying to clear the vision, but the face only became clearer. And then it hit me. It was mine. The figure's face, its eyes, were my own. I staggered backward, my legs weak, my mind reeling. What was this place? What was happening? I had to get out. I had to escape. But how? The figure reached out, its hand extending toward me, its fingers long and twisted, like those of a corpse. It moved so fast, I didn't have time to react. Its hand closed around my wrist, and a shock of cold ran through me, as though its touch was draining the life from my body. You can never leave, it whispered, its voice echoing in my mind, in my soul. Once you come here, you are ours. I screamed, but the room swallowed my voice, and everything went dark. I woke to the sound of distant water dripping, a soft, rhythmic tap 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 that seemed to come from all directions. My head was pounding, my vision blurred. I tried to move, but my body felt heavy, as if I were trapped beneath a great weight. It took a moment to realize that I was lying on the cold, hard floor of the room, yet it felt so much different now. The oppressive silence had been replaced with a faint hum, a low vibration that rattled my bones. My fingers twitched, and I slowly sat up, every movement slow and stiff, as if my muscles were protesting, reluctant to respond. The room around me felt wrong. The shadows clung to the walls, moving as though alive, and the air was thick with a kind of heaviness that made it hard to breathe. I could still hear the figure's voice in my mind, "You can never leave," and it gnawed at the edges of my consciousness, refusing to let me forget. I had to get out. I didn't know how long I'd been unconscious, but the longer I stayed here, the more I felt the pull of this place, the more I felt like I was becoming a part of it. I shakily rose to my feet, the floor beneath me creaking in protest. My flashlight, which had been flickering before, was now completely dead. I was in complete darkness, save for the faintest glow coming from the far side of the room. I instinctively moved toward it, the pull of something unseen guiding me, though every step felt like a violation of my better judgment. As I got closer, I noticed something on the ground. At first, I thought it was just more dust, but upon closer inspection, I realized the shapes were footprints. Small, delicate indentations in the dirt, leading toward the center of the room. The further I followed them, the more they seemed to distort, as if the ground itself were changing under my feet. The temperature dropped again. It was as if the very air had turned to ice. I shivered, my breath coming out in a visible cloud. Suddenly, I felt it. A presence, moving in the darkness. It was close, too close. Something, or someone, was in the room with me. My pulse quickened, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. I didn't dare turn around. I just kept walking, my eyes locked on the strange glowing spot ahead. It seemed to pull at me, almost like a magnet, urging me forward. The footprints in the dust led straight to the glow. And as I stepped into the light, I saw it. A mirror. It was old, framed in dark wood that looked ancient. The glass was cracked in several places, the fractures twisting across its surface like veins in marble. And yet, despite the damage, it still reflected my image perfectly. Or at least, it seemed to. But as I stood there, staring at my own reflection, something shifted. The reflection didn't quite match my movements. I reached out, and the figure in the mirror did not mirror me. It was slower, jerky, like it was struggling to keep up. Then, I saw it. Behind me. In the mirror, someone, was standing just out of my reach. The same figure I had seen earlier, its face still a blurred, shifting mass. Its hand reached for me, but it was not the same as before. The fingers were longer now, gnarled and twisted, with dark, almost black nails that scraped against the mirror's surface, leaving deep scratches. I could hear the noise, the sickening sound of claws dragging across glass, and a sickening chill ran down my spine. I turned around in a panic, but there was nothing there. The room was empty. I looked back at the mirror, and my reflection was unchanged, except for one thing. It was smiling. A twisted, mocking grin spread across my face in the reflection, but I hadn't moved. I hadn't even opened my mouth. My heart slammed against my chest, my breath coming out in ragged gasps. "Leave," the voice whispered again, this time echoing from all around me. It was not coming from the figure in the mirror, it was coming from everywhere. The walls. The floor. The ceiling. The house itself was speaking to me. I had to leave. I had to. But the door, the way I had entered the room, was gone. The space that had once been there now seemed to stretch into infinity, the walls now solid and impenetrable. The reflection in the mirror continued to smile, and it was not just my face anymore. It had become something different. A distorted version of me, but not me. Its eyes were hollow, black pits, and its grin widened impossibly, its teeth sharp and unnaturally white. I stepped back, my feet stumbling over the uneven floor as the figure in the mirror raised a hand toward me, its mouth moving, though I could hear nothing but the deafening hum in my ears. "You should have listened," it whispered, its voice like 1,000 voices, overlapping and merging into one. The mirror began to crack again, but this time the cracks didn't stop. The glass shattered into shards, scattering across the floor, but the figure inside, the one that wasn't me, remained. I spun around in a panic, looking for any way out, any way to escape. There had to be something. But the room seemed to be closing in, the walls pressing inward, the shadows thickening, and the sound of the water, so steady at first, was now growing louder, almost deafening. Suddenly, I heard something else. A low, guttural noise, like something moving, something heavy, dragging itself across the floor behind me. I didn't want to turn around, but I had to. I forced myself to look. It was there. It had followed me from the mirror. The figure, now more distorted than ever, was dragging itself toward me, its limbs moving in unnatural angles, its body folding in on itself, the shadows twisting and curling around it like a living fog. It was getting closer, and the room was growing darker, colder. The very air seemed to be thick with its presence. It was too late to run. And then, the house spoke again. "You will never leave." And the darkness swallowed me whole. I couldn't move. My limbs felt paralyzed, as if the very air around me had solidified into chains, binding me in place. The figure, now just a grotesque mass of writhing shadows and distorted limbs, closed the distance between us with horrifying slowness. Its face, no, it wasn't a face anymore, was just a patch of shifting darkness, with hollow eyes that gleamed like black voids. I opened my mouth to scream, but no sound came out. My heart thudded painfully in my chest, and the world seemed to shrink around me, the edges of the room blurring as if I were looking through a fogged window. The figure reached out with one of its elongated arms, its fingers twisting unnaturally as they inched closer to my throat. I couldn't breathe. The air was thick, suffocating. I felt like I was drowning as the sound of rushing water grew louder, echoing in my skull. The thing in front of me, if you could even call it that, smiled. Its grin widened even further, its lips stretching impossibly, revealing rows of sharp, jagged teeth that seemed to go on forever, filling the entire expanse of its face. My body was screaming at me to run, to fight, but my muscles refused to cooperate. The sensation of being trapped was all-encompassing. I was drowning in it. And then, something snapped. I don't know what changed, but suddenly, I was free. Not physically, no, I was still rooted to the spot. But something deep within me, some primal survival instinct, kicked in. My mind began to race, calculating, searching for any way out of this nightmare. I didn't know how, but I knew I had to do something. I had to fight back. Without thinking, I turned and bolted toward the nearest corner of the room, my body moving of its own accord. My hands fumbled desperately for anything that could help me. My fingers brushed over the cold stone walls, the rough texture of the ancient bricks scraping against my skin as I desperately searched. And then I found it. A small crack, barely noticeable at first, hidden among the stones. My breath caught in my throat as I pressed my fingers into it. The crack widened, revealing a narrow, dark tunnel beyond it. It was a way out. I didn't hesitate. I crawled into the darkness, my body trembling with fear and adrenaline as I forced my way into the narrow passage. My heart hammered in my chest as the sound of the creature's twisted breathing echoed behind me, its presence still looming, far too close. I kept moving, the walls pressing in on either side, the air growing colder with every inch I crawled. My fingers scraped against the jagged rocks, the blood seeping from my palms as I clawed my way forward. But I couldn't stop. I wouldn't stop. I heard it then, a low, distorted sound, like a distant scream. The creature was following me. I had to move faster. My limbs burned with exhaustion, my lungs screamed for air, but the tunnel stretched on endlessly, with no sign of escape. The darkness around me seemed to thicken, pressing in like a living, breathing thing, but I pushed forward. There was no turning back now. The tunnel finally opened up, and I stumbled into a wide, empty space. The air here was different, thinner, somehow. And then, I saw it. A door. A wooden door, weathered and cracked, standing alone in the middle of the room. I couldn't believe my eyes. Was this another trap? Another dead end? Or was this the way out? I didn't wait to find out. I ran toward it, my heart pounding so loudly that it drowned out everything else. My hand shook as I grabbed the handle, turning it desperately. The door creaked open, revealing the faintest sliver of light beyond. I stepped through, and when I turned around, the room was gone. The basement. The mirrors. The thing that had been chasing me. They were all gone. I was back in the house, back in the apartment where it all started. It was dark, but I could hear the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen, the soft rustling of leaves outside the window. I could hear the distant sound of a car passing by on the street. It was quiet. Normal. Safe. For a moment, I just stood there, gasping for breath, trying to make sense of it all. Had it been a dream? Had it all been in my head? But then, I saw it. The mirror. It was there, in the hallway, where it had never been before. The reflection of the room seemed off somehow, as if the edges of the room bled into something else, something wrong. And then, in the glass, I saw it. The thing. It was standing there, just behind me, its face a blur of shadow and nightmare. I could see its hollow eyes staring at me through the glass, that twisted grin stretching across its face once more. You can never leave. The voice echoed in my mind, and I knew then that I hadn't escaped. Not really. I was still trapped. Trapped in this place, in this house. And whatever that thing was, it would never let me go. I turned away from the mirror, my heart sinking as the world around me began to warp. The walls twisted, the floor beneath me groaned. And I understood. It wasn't the house that had trapped me. It was something far worse. Something that lived within it. And no matter where I went, it would always follow. Always watch. Always wait. And I would never truly be free. Have you ever looked into a mirror and felt like it was showing you something different? Something that wasn't quite you or wasn't quite right? I never paid much attention to my reflection. But that day, when I stepped into the old, dusty antique shop at the edge of town, something changed. The moment I walked through the door, I felt a chill creep up my spine, like a hand brushing against the back of my neck. The air smelled of old wood, stale air, and something else, something I couldn't place. As if time itself had forgotten this place. The shop was cluttered with relics, some fascinating, some strange. Shelves crammed with tarnished silverware, faded paintings, and trinkets that had probably belonged to someone long dead. But it was the mirror that caught my attention. It stood in the back corner, partially obscured by a thick velvet curtain. It wasn't like any mirror I'd ever seen. Its frame was dark, almost black, carved with intricate, curling designs that seemed to shift if you looked at them too long. It had an aura to it, something I couldn't explain, like it was waiting. I approached it hesitantly. My breath fogged the glass as I leaned closer, looking at my own reflection. But something was wrong. The reflection I saw wasn't mine, not entirely. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light. Maybe my eyes were tired. But no! The person in the mirror wasn't me. Their face was pale, almost sickly, and their eyes were too wide, too hollow. It looked like a version of me, but not the one I knew. I stepped back, my heart racing, but the reflection didn't move with me. It stayed still, staring at me with those unnervingly empty eyes. I blinked, and in that brief moment, the reflection grinned. It wasn't just a smile. It was a smile full of malice, of something darker. The kind of grin that made my blood run cold. I turned away quickly, a shiver crawling down my spine. But before I could take a step, I heard it, soft, almost imperceptible, but it was there. A sound. A whisper. Come back. I froze. The voice was a mere echo, almost like a shadow passing through my mind. It wasn't loud, but it was clear. And somehow, it felt like it was coming from inside my own head. I spun around to face the mirror again, and this time it was different. The reflection of me was still there, but it had moved. It wasn't just standing still anymore. It was closer, its eyes locked onto mine, its lips curling into that same eerie grin. I could feel its gaze on me, like it was aware of me, of my thoughts. I turned away again, my pulse quickening, my breath shallow. I told myself it was nothing, just an old, warped mirror, maybe some illusion from the years of dust and decay. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. I felt something pull at me, something sinister that I couldn't quite understand, urging me back to that mirror. I didn't listen to it, though. Not yet. But I couldn't shake the feeling that the reflection wasn't just an image, it was alive. And it wanted me to come back. The shopkeeper noticed me staring, his eyes narrowing with what seemed like recognition. He wasn't an old man, but his face carried the weight of years, years that maybe had seen too much. "You've found the mirror," he said in a gravelly voice. His eyes flicked to the mirror and then back to me, his lips twitching as though he was holding something back. "It's not what it seems," he added. I nodded slowly, stepping away from the mirror, but the pull was stronger now, a presence, a force that seemed to fill the room. The shopkeeper's voice grew softer, as if warning me. "It shows more than just your reflection. It shows what you truly desire, or fear." I didn't understand what he meant, but there was something in his eyes, something that warned me to stay away. I turned and walked toward the door, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the mirror was watching me, following my every move. And then, just before I left the shop, I heard the whisper again. "You can't escape me." The door slammed shut behind me, but the voice lingered, echoing in my ears. And when I reached into my pocket to grab my keys, I noticed something strange. My fingers were cold, colder than they should have been. And then it hit me. The reflection. It wasn't gone. It had followed me. It was waiting. I barely slept that night. My mind kept circling back to the mirror, the reflection, the whisper, that chilling smile. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw it. Every time I looked in the bathroom mirror, I couldn't shake the feeling that the person staring back at me wasn't entirely me. It was like a shadow, always just behind my own image, waiting to step out and take over. The next morning, I decided to go back. I couldn't explain why. I just knew I had to. It was as if the mirror had planted a seed in my mind, one that grew with each passing minute. I walked to the shop again, the cold autumn air biting at my skin. The streets were quiet, the kind of quiet that feels unnatural, like the world is holding its breath. I reached the shop, and for a moment, I hesitated. The door creaked when I pushed it open, and the familiar scent of dust and old wood wrapped around me. The shopkeeper was behind the counter, looking up from his newspaper as I entered. He didn't seem surprised to see me. He didn't even look startled. His expression was almost resigned. "I knew you'd be back," he said, his voice low, as if he'd been expecting me. "It's always the same." I swallowed hard, feeling my throat tighten. "What's wrong with that mirror?" The shopkeeper sighed and stood up slowly. His movements were deliberate, like he was weighing whether to tell me anything at all. "That mirror doesn't just show your reflection," he said softly. "It reflects what you want or what you fear. It taps into things deep inside you, things you might not even be aware of. And once you see what's in it, it doesn't let you go. It never does." His words sank into my mind, but I couldn't quite understand what he meant. "So what happens if I look again?" The shopkeeper didn't answer immediately. Instead, he glanced over at the mirror, as if making sure it hadn't changed. His eyes narrowed, and he took a step toward me. "You don't want to look again," he said, his voice urgent. "Trust me, you don't. It might seem like it's harmless, just a reflection, but it's not. It starts small, but over time, the line between what's real and what's in the mirror becomes blurred. And then it's too late." I wanted to ask more, to understand what he meant by that. But something in his face, something in the way his hand twitched toward the counter, told me that he wasn't going to tell me everything. Maybe he couldn't. Without another word, I turned and made my way to the back of the shop, where the mirror stood. It beckoned me, its dark frame almost pulling me in. I felt its presence like a weight on my chest, pressing down harder with every step I took. The air around it seemed colder, and the shadows in the corners of the room seemed deeper, darker. When I stood in front of it again, I braced myself. My reflection was there, as it had been before, but now it seemed wrong. The version of me in the mirror wasn't just standing there. It was moving. I could see it in the corner of my eye. The figure, my reflection, wasn't just mimicking me. It was doing things I hadn't done. Its hands twitched, fingers curling as though they were trying to reach out. And its eyes, they were locked on mine, but they weren't my eyes. The reflection grinned again, that same twisted, malicious smile. I stepped back, heart racing. My breath caught in my throat, but the reflection didn't follow me. It stayed where it was, locked in place, like a frozen image. For a moment, I thought it had stopped, that it was done. But then, I saw something even worse. The reflection started to move without me. Its mouth began to move slowly, almost mechanically, forming words. You're mine now. My stomach twisted in fear. I turned away from the mirror, desperate to escape its pull, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that the reflection was still there, lurking just behind me. Suddenly, I heard the door chime as someone else entered the shop. The shopkeeper turned toward the sound, but I didn't look back. I couldn't. I didn't want to see what was in the mirror anymore. Not today. Not ever. But when I walked to the door, I felt it, the weight of the reflection, still pressing on me. I glanced at the mirror one last time, and for the briefest moment, I thought I saw something else. Not just my reflection. Not just the strange version of me. In the mirror, standing behind me, was someone else, a figure, tall and dark, standing just out of the frame. Its presence was like a shadow that I couldn't escape. It wasn't me. It wasn't anyone I knew. And it was staring at me. I didn't go back to the mirror. I couldn't. My mind raced with questions, but none of them seemed to make sense. Who was that figure in the mirror? Why was it there, lurking just out of sight? I could feel it still, that cold sensation lingering on my skin, as though something was following me, just beyond my reach. The following days passed in a blur. I stayed in my apartment, avoiding reflective surfaces. Every mirror, every window, every shiny surface seemed like it might betray me, showing that thing behind me. I didn't trust myself to look. I barely trusted the world around me. I tried to go about my daily life, but it was impossible to forget what I'd seen. Every time I closed my eyes, I could hear the voice that had come from the reflection. You're mine now. The words echoed in my mind, a constant reminder of the darkness that seemed to seep into my thoughts. It was like a presence, something that had taken root deep within me. But it wasn't just in my mind. I started noticing things. Small things, at first. The way the lights flickered when I passed by them. The way the shadows in my apartment grew longer, deeper, when I wasn't looking. At night, the air felt thick, oppressive, as though something was waiting. Watching. I couldn't escape it. No matter where I went, the feeling followed. And it was getting worse. One evening, I couldn't take it anymore. I needed answers. I had to go back to the shop, find out more about that mirror, about what was happening to me. I had to know if I was losing my mind or if something far worse was at play. The streets outside were empty, and the wind howled through the alleys. The city felt abandoned, like I was the only one left. The shop was quiet when I entered, just as it had been before. The shopkeeper was there, sitting behind the counter, his eyes fixed on me as I walked in. You've been gone for a while, he said, his tone flat. I was wondering when you'd come back. I didn't have time for pleasantries. What is happening to me? I demanded. What's with the mirror? What's that thing I saw in it? The shopkeeper stood slowly, his face unreadable. He looked at me, his gaze softening with something like pity. I told you, he said. That mirror, it shows you more than just your reflection. It shows your true self, your desires, your fears, everything that lies beneath the surface. It taps into the part of you that you're too afraid to acknowledge. And once it has you, it doesn't let go. I clenched my fists, trying to push back the rising panic. But who is the figure in the mirror? It's not me. It's someone else. The shopkeeper's expression darkened. It's a reflection of the part of you that you don't want to face. Sometimes it takes shape, becomes something else. A shadow of your mind. And when it's fully awake, when it's free, he trailed off as if he didn't want to say the next words. But what happens then? I pressed. What do I do? How do I stop it? The shopkeeper hesitated. He seemed to be weighing whether to tell me more. Finally, he spoke again, his voice quiet, almost a whisper. You can't stop it, he said. Not once it's awake. You can try to run, but it follows you. It feeds on your fear. And soon, it won't be content to stay in the mirror anymore. It will want more. It will want you. My stomach dropped. The reality of what he was saying hit me like a cold slap. I was trapped. I turned away from him, my heart pounding in my chest. What do I do? How do I fix this? You can't, the shopkeeper repeated. The mirror, it chooses. And once it chooses you, it's over. I felt a wave of dizziness rush over me, my head spinning. I grabbed onto the counter to steady myself, but the world around me seemed to blur. The shopkeeper's voice seemed distant, as though coming from somewhere far away. You're already changing, he added, his words sharp, cutting through my panic. The reflection, it's already beginning to take over. You'll see it. Soon. I stumbled out of the shop, my heart racing in my chest. It felt like I was being suffocated by the air itself. The city around me seemed to close in, the buildings pressing down, the streets stretching endlessly ahead, empty and cold. I didn't know where I was going, only that I had to keep moving. I made my way back to my apartment, but the feeling of being watched didn't leave. It was there in the corners of my vision, just out of reach. Every time I looked in a window, I thought I saw it. A shadow, a figure, always watching, always waiting. That night, I finally gave in. I couldn't avoid it any longer. I had to face it, had to see it again. I needed to know how far this thing had gotten, what it had done to me. I stood in front of my bathroom mirror, my hands shaking. My reflection stared back at me, as it always had. But as I looked closer, I noticed something. The smile, it wasn't mine. It was a twisted, sinister grin, one that wasn't a part of me. And then it moved. The reflection in the mirror stepped toward me, its eyes gleaming with malice. The grin widened, stretching unnaturally. My breath caught in my throat as I saw it for what it truly was, an entity, alive and hungry, and it wasn't just in the mirror anymore. It was coming for me. I stumbled back, my body trembling. The figure in the mirror wasn't just a reflection anymore. It was real. It stood there, inches away from me, its eyes piercing right through me, as though it could see into the depths of my soul. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body felt frozen in place, as if bound by some invisible force. It tilted its head, studying me with a twisted curiosity, and the grin, it never faded. It just grew wider, more grotesque, as though it was savoring my fear. My heart hammered in my chest, each beat louder than the last. The sound of it was deafening, pounding in my ears. I had to get away. I had to move, now. But no matter how hard I tried, my feet wouldn't obey. I couldn't break away from that gaze. It was like the reflection was holding me there, keeping me from escaping. And then it happened. The figure in the mirror, it moved again. Its hand, pale and long, reached out. The fingers stretched unnaturally, like they were made of some otherworldly substance. My breath hitched as I realized that the hand wasn't just reaching anymore. It was pushing through the glass, sliding through it like the surface of water, as if the mirror were made of liquid, not solid glass. The sensation of cold hit me first, a freezing chill that crawled up my arm, a chill that wasn't from the air around me but from something else, something coming from the mirror. My skin prickled. My thoughts raced, but they felt distant, like they were no longer mine. The hand emerged fully from the glass, its fingers curling into a claw. The reflection in the mirror stepped through, one foot dragging behind it, its form finally free from its prison. It was now in my world. I gasped, stumbling backward, my heart gripped by terror. The creature, thing, that had once been my reflection was now a presence in my reality. It didn't belong here. And yet, there it was, towering over me with its impossible grin. It was as if it was never bound by the same rules that governed the world I lived in. It took a step toward me, and I froze. My mind screamed for me to move, but my body refused to respond. The air felt suffocating, heavy with something dark, something that didn't belong. "Do you see?" The voice came again, not my own voice, but its voice. The reflection's voice. It was cold, like the echo of something deep and forgotten. "This is your truth. You are nothing without me." I wanted to scream, to fight back, but the words caught in my throat. Every part of me was locked in place. The air around us was thickening, closing in, and I realized in that moment I wasn't alone. I never had been. This thing, this shadow of my mind, had been following me all along. It had always been there, just out of sight, waiting for the right moment to step into the light. I could feel it, its presence wrapping itself around me, tightening like a noose. The fear surged, but it wasn't just fear anymore. It was something else, something deeper. A realization. This thing wanted me. It needed me. And I wasn't sure if I could escape it. I broke free. I don't know how. My body moved without my consent, a reflex to survive. I ran. I stumbled through the apartment, the walls seeming to close in around me, the air thick with dread. I didn't dare look behind me. I knew it was there, following, always watching. I had to leave. I had to get away. I ran out of the apartment, into the hallway, down the stairs, through the front door. The cold night air hit me like a slap to the face, but it was nothing compared to the chill that still lingered in my veins. I didn't stop running. My breath came in ragged gasps, the weight of what had just happened pressing down on me. I didn't know where I was going. I didn't know if I could escape. But I had to try. The reflection, it wasn't done with me. Not by a long shot. I glanced over my shoulder. The street behind me was empty. The only sound was the beating of my heart in my chest, the rhythm of my own terror. But the feeling didn't go away. The sensation of being watched, of it watching me, never stopped. It was as though the reflection had imprinted itself into my very being, into every shadow, every corner, every crevice of my mind. I knew then that the only way to stop this, if it was even possible, was to destroy the mirror. To sever whatever connection it had to me. But I had no idea how to do that, or if I could even get near it again without the reflection taking me. I kept walking, the darkness swallowing me whole. I thought I could still feel the cold presence behind me, creeping through the corners of my vision. I wanted to look back, to make sure I wasn't imagining it, but I didn't dare. It was watching me. It was waiting. And I knew one thing for certain, I wasn't safe. Not anymore. I couldn't escape the feeling that it was always there, just out of sight, waiting for me to slip up. No matter how far I ran, No matter how many miles I put between myself and the apartment, that chilling presence lingered like a shadow that refused to fade. I tried to convince myself it was just fear, just the aftermath of what I'd seen. But deep down, I knew. It wasn't my imagination. It was real. The reflection had crossed into my world, and I had no idea what it wanted from me. The next few days were a blur of restless nights and sleepless mornings. Every time I closed my eyes, I could see that twisted grin. Every shadow seemed to stretch a little too far. Every mirror, no matter how small, felt like a trap. I couldn't escape it. I knew I had to go back to the apartment. I had to face it. There was no other choice. If I didn't confront the reflection, it would only grow stronger, its grip on me tightening with each passing day. But the idea of going back, of seeing that thing again, filled me with such dread that I nearly vomited at the thought. But what was I supposed to do? Hide forever? No. I couldn't keep running. I had to end it one way or another. I took a deep breath, trying to calm the storm in my chest, and grabbed the keys to my apartment. The familiar weight in my hand did nothing to comfort me, but I forced myself to move, walking toward the building with determination. I had to face it. As I entered the building, the air felt thick, heavy. The hallways seemed longer than I remembered, the walls closing in on me with every step. My heartbeat quickened, and I could feel the sweat on my palms as I reached the door to my apartment. The door creaked as I pushed it open, the sound eerily loud in the silence. I stepped inside, the familiar layout of the apartment now somehow wrong. The shadows seemed darker, deeper. The reflection had tainted everything. I couldn't see it, but I felt it. It was watching me. I walked toward the mirror. It was still there, standing in the corner of the room, its surface dark and smooth. I could feel the cold emanating from it, a chill that froze me to the bone. The grin. I could almost see it, just under the surface, like the reflection was waiting for me to make the first move. I reached out, my hand trembling. It felt unnatural, as though my fingers weren't my own. But I pressed on, touching the cool glass. For a moment, nothing happened. But then, the surface seemed to ripple, like water disturbed by a stone, and I felt something, someone, on the other side. The reflection grinned wider, its eyes locked onto mine, its expression filled with something I couldn't describe. Satisfaction? Malice? It didn't matter. It had me. It owned me. But this time, I wasn't afraid. Not anymore. I'd had enough. I stepped closer, staring into the reflection. "What do you want from me?" I whispered, my voice shaking. The reflection's smile faltered for a split second, and in that moment, I knew I had it. It was vulnerable. It wasn't expecting me to stand up to it. It wasn't expecting me to fight. And then I did something I never thought I'd do. I reached into the mirror. It was as if I was pushing my hand through liquid. The cold sensation seeped up my arm, freezing me to my core, but I didn't pull away. I shoved my entire arm into the mirror, and suddenly, the room felt like it was spinning, the walls twisting and distorting around me. The reflection screamed, a high-pitched, screeching sound that pierced my ears, but I didn't let go. I had to hold on. And then, with one final, desperate tug, I yanked my arm back. The mirror cracked. It was like everything shattered at once, the walls, the air, the silence. The reflection screeched, its image distorting, breaking apart as the glass fractured into a million pieces. I stepped back, gasping for air, my heart racing. For a moment, I thought it was over, that I had won. But then I heard it. A soft, low laugh echoing from the shadows. I spun around, but there was no one there. The laugh continued, growing louder, more distorted. It was coming from everywhere, surrounding me, suffocating me. It was in my mind, crawling into my thoughts. I realized then that I hadn't destroyed the reflection. I had only broken the mirror. The thing in it, the thing that had been waiting for me, it had shifted. It was no longer bound by the glass. It was inside me, and it was never letting go. And I knew, deep down, that I would never escape it. Not now. Not ever. The reflection had taken me, and it wasn't done with me yet. Have you ever felt like you were being watched, but couldn't see who was there? Maybe it's just your imagination playing tricks on you, right? That's what I kept telling myself, too, at first. It started a few weeks ago when I moved into the small, old apartment on the outskirts of the city. The place was cheap and quiet, perfect for someone like me who needed a fresh start. I didn't think much of it when I noticed the strange feeling that crept over me every time I was alone. The air in the apartment was always still, heavy. At first, I thought it was just the silence, the isolation, something that came with living alone. But then, it started. It wasn't a sound, not at first. It was just a feeling, a presence behind me. Whenever I was sitting, doing anything at all, like reading or eating, it would be there. It felt like someone was standing right behind me, just out of my sight. I would turn around, but the room was always empty. At first, I thought it was nothing more than my nerves, the quiet getting to me, maybe. But the feeling persisted. It wasn't until the second week that I began to notice something strange. The air, the atmosphere in the room, seemed to shift when I was near certain spots. The living room, for example, there was this corner by the window where the feeling was the strongest. I could feel it even when I wasn't looking at it. A heaviness, like someone was watching me. It made my skin crawl, but I couldn't explain it. And then it happened for the first time, the sound. I was sitting on the couch, scrolling through my phone, when I heard it. At first, it was just a soft puff of air, like a sigh. But it wasn't from the other side of the room. It was behind me. I froze, my heart racing, and turned around quickly, but there was nothing. No one. I was alone, as I always was. But the air, the weight of it, still lingered. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe I had imagined it. The apartment was old, after all. The building creaked, the pipes groaned. I thought I was being paranoid, that it was just the sound of the building settling. But then it happened again. And again. Each time, the sound grew a little louder, a little clearer. It was a slow, rhythmic exhale, like someone standing right behind me, breathing quietly, deliberately. The more I heard it, the more certain I became that it wasn't just my imagination. There was something, or someone, there, and it was following me. I couldn't ignore it anymore. Every time I moved, I could feel the presence behind me. It was like a weight on my back, an invisible pressure, and I couldn't escape it. Even when I went to bed at night, I would lie there in the dark, listening to the steady sound of breath coming from somewhere close, but just out of reach. The walls of the apartment felt thinner, the space smaller. I began to dread being in certain rooms, the ones where the feeling was strongest, where the breath seemed to be coming from. I tried to stay out of them, but I couldn't avoid the bathroom, the hallway, the kitchen. It was everywhere. At first, I thought it might be the apartment's poor ventilation. Or maybe there was something wrong with the pipes, some kind of draft. But no matter how many times I checked, nothing explained the sound. No loose pipes, no vents. The air in the apartment never felt right, like it was always just a little too cold, a little too still. And then one night, it was louder. The breathing was so close, so undeniable, I could almost feel the warm air against the back of my neck. My skin prickled with fear, and I couldn't move. I didn't dare turn around. That's when I heard it. A whisper, barely audible, but it was there. Turn around. I held my breath, my entire body frozen. The voice was faint, like a breath that didn't belong to me. I wanted to run. I wanted to scream, but my throat was tight, my voice trapped inside me. I couldn't make a sound. Then it happened. The next exhale wasn't just the sound of breathing. It was like a shift, a movement in the air. Something touched me, lightly, almost like a hand grazing my back. But when I spun around, no one was there. I ran out of the apartment that night, not even bothering to pack. I couldn't explain what I felt, but I knew one thing: whatever was there, whatever was breathing behind me, wasn't human. I thought I could leave, but the fear didn't go away. It followed me. And now, as I sit here, I can still feel it, the breath on my neck. I don't know what it is, or how to stop it, but one thing is certain: I'll never be alone in that apartment again. And it's not just the apartment. It's me. Whatever it is, it's coming with me. And it's getting closer. The days passed in a blur after that night. I didn't return to the apartment. I couldn't. The feeling of that breath, so close to my skin, had etched itself into my mind. Even when I stayed with friends or in other places, I couldn't shake the sensation of something watching me. It was always there, just at the edge of my consciousness, like a shadow that refused to leave. I found myself jumping at every small sound, every whisper of wind. It was as if the world had become a bit less real, a little more threatening. My sleep became fractured, and I began to feel like I was living in a haze, disconnected from reality. The air always felt thick, as if it was pressing in on me, suffocating me. I tried to convince myself it was just paranoia, that my mind was playing tricks. But deep down, I knew better. I knew something had changed. Something had followed me out of that apartment. I started avoiding mirrors. Every time I caught a glimpse of myself, I felt like I didn't belong in my own reflection. Something was different, something was wrong. My eyes were always searching, always looking for something I couldn't explain. One day, I decided to go back. I don't know what made me do it. Maybe I thought I could confront it, face whatever was lurking in that apartment. Or maybe I just wanted to prove to myself that I wasn't losing my mind. I walked up the stairs to the building, my heart hammering in my chest. The old wooden steps creaked under my feet, the sound echoing in the empty hall. The door to my apartment was still locked, the keys heavy in my pocket. I stood there for what felt like an eternity before I finally turned the key and stepped inside. The apartment was exactly as I had left it, quiet, still. It smelled faintly of dust and stale air. But the moment I crossed the threshold, the atmosphere shifted. It was as if the air had thickened, as if something unseen was waiting for me. I moved cautiously, my footsteps hesitant. Every creak of the floorboards sounded like a warning. The living room was dark, the only light coming from a dim street lamp outside the window. I didn't want to look, but I knew I had to. I stepped closer to the corner where the feeling had always been strongest. And there, in the shadows, I saw it. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light. A reflection, maybe, from the street lamp outside. But no! It wasn't. A figure stood there, just out of reach, a shape I couldn't fully make out. Its presence was suffocating, like the room itself had closed in around me. The air was cold, colder than it had any right to be. And the breathing was louder now, so loud that it almost drowned out everything else. I didn't know what to do. My legs felt like they were made of stone, unable to move. My breath caught in my throat, and my pulse was erratic, a steady thrum of panic in my veins. Then, the figure stepped forward. It wasn't like a person. It wasn't even human. It was more like a shadow, a distortion of the space around it, flickering and shifting as it moved. And as it came closer, I could hear its breathing more clearly, short, shallow gasps, like it was struggling for air. It reached out, but not toward me. It seemed to reach past me, as if something was calling to it from behind. I stumbled back, my hand grabbing for the door, but the figure didn't stop. It was so close now, I could feel the air around me shift with its movement. And then, from the corner of my eye, I saw something else. A reflection. Not mine. It was the figure. It was standing in the reflection of the hallway mirror, just behind me, its eyes, if you could call them eyes, staring directly at me. The reflection smiled. The thing in the mirror was smiling. I didn't wait for it to move any closer. I bolted, running out of the apartment and down the stairs. I didn't look back, and I didn't stop until I was outside, gulping in the fresh air, my heart racing. But even then, I could still feel it. The breath. It was still there, behind me, waiting. It had followed me, but now it was worse. It was inside me, too. Every time I closed my eyes, I could hear it, its breath, always there, always waiting. And the worst part? I couldn't escape it. Not anymore. It wasn't just the apartment anymore. It wasn't just the mirror. The thing behind me, it had become a part of me. The days after that night were a blur. I couldn't go back to my apartment, and I couldn't stay at my friends' places forever. They didn't understand. I had tried to explain, but they looked at me with concern, as if I had gone mad. Maybe I had. I started staying in hotels. A different one every night. I didn't want to stay in any one place too long. I couldn't. The thing that followed me, it wasn't just confined to a space anymore. It had attached itself to me, to my very presence. I could feel it everywhere I went. At night, when the world was quiet, I could hear its breath. Sometimes it would be soft, just a whisper in the dark. Other times, it would be loud, rasping, as if it was right behind me. I would spin around, but nothing would be there. I had become paranoid, constantly checking over my shoulder, expecting to see it, waiting to see it. I couldn't escape the sensation. It was like a shadow at my back, always there, no matter how fast I ran or how far I traveled. The reflection in the mirror was the worst part. I couldn't look at myself anymore without seeing it there, its dark, hollow eyes staring at me from the glass. Sometimes, when I passed a mirror, I would catch a glimpse of it, standing just behind me, its form flickering in and out like a glitch in reality. One evening, I found myself walking down an empty street, the cold night air biting at my skin. I wasn't sure where I was going, but I had to keep moving. I had to keep away from the feeling, from the breath. That's when I saw the shop. It was small, tucked in between two larger buildings. The kind of place you wouldn't notice unless you were looking for it. The sign above the door was faded, the letters barely visible. Antiques, it read. It looked like an ordinary shop, but something about it, something deep in my gut, told me it wasn't. I stepped inside. The smell of old wood and dust filled the air. The shop was dimly lit, with shelves upon shelves of antiques, trinkets, and old furniture. Everything was covered in a thin layer of dust, as if it hadn't been touched in years. The silence was suffocating. I walked down the narrow aisles, my footsteps echoing in the emptiness. And then I saw it. A mirror. It was small, oval-shaped, with a tarnished silver frame. It was old, much older than any mirror I had ever seen. And as I stood before it, I felt it again, the breath. The pressure behind me. I turned quickly, but there was no one there. The shop was empty. The reflection in the mirror was different this time. I wasn't sure what it was at first. It was me, but it wasn't. The figure in the mirror, it wasn't just standing there anymore. It was moving. And it was smiling. It reached out, and I felt a chill run down my spine. The reflection in the mirror was no longer just an image. It was something else, something alive, something real. I could feel it. I could feel its presence behind me, even though I knew it wasn't just me. It was in the mirror. It was alive. I stepped back, my heart racing. But the reflection didn't move. It stayed there, smiling, its dark eyes following my every move. The breathing, the breath I had been hearing for so long, seemed to come from the mirror now, louder, sharper, like it was trying to break through. I turned and ran out of the shop, my mind reeling. I couldn't think. I couldn't breathe. The street outside was empty. I was alone, but I could still hear it. The breathing. It was louder than ever, echoing in my ears, drowning out everything else. I had to leave. I had to get away from it. But no matter where I went, no matter how far I ran, it would always be there. Right behind me. It wasn't just in the mirrors anymore. It was in my head. It was in the very air I breathed. I couldn't escape it. It had followed me home. And now it was inside me, too. I tried everything. I even went to a therapist, hoping to talk about it, to make sense of the madness that was taking over my life. The doctor was kind, patient. He listened to me, nodded, and suggested I might be experiencing heightened anxiety, maybe even hallucinations. But nothing he said helped. He didn't understand. No one did. The breathing, the reflection, they were real. So real that sometimes, when I woke up in the middle of the night, I could feel its hot, damp breath on the back of my neck. It was as if it was right there, just waiting for me to turn around. But when I did, there was nothing. Only the shadows. And the reflection. The apartment I had rented before, I had left that behind. The sound of breathing there had been too much to handle, but the echoes of it followed me wherever I went. In every room, in every mirror, it was always there. I could never outrun it. No matter where I went, no matter how far I traveled, the breath grew louder and louder. I was breaking. I could feel it in my bones. One night, I woke up again. The room was silent. But something felt different. Something was wrong. The air was thick. The space felt smaller, suffocating. I sat up, trying to push the covers off, but my body was frozen. I couldn't move. It was as if something had a grip on me, as if I was trapped in my own skin. Then I heard it. That breath. That terrible, rasping breath. It was right behind me. I felt its presence before I even turned. Slowly, I turned my head toward the bedroom mirror, not daring to move my body. The reflection was distorted. It wasn't me looking back at me. No, it was something else. It was the thing. It was no longer trapped inside the glass. It had escaped. It was in my room. I could feel it, just behind me. I could feel its cold fingers brushing the back of my neck. My heartbeat was so loud it drowned out everything else, the breathing, the whispers. My chest felt tight as if it was pressing against me. It was real. I leaped out of bed, but my legs didn't respond. I stumbled, falling onto the floor with a crash. But even as I lay there, I could hear it. Closer now. Its breath was slow and deliberate, like it was savoring the moment. Savoring me. I scrambled toward the door, my hands shaking as I tried to turn the handle. But it wouldn't budge. The door was stuck. No matter how hard I pulled, it wouldn't open. I was trapped. With every passing second, the breathing grew louder. Closer. I could almost feel its presence touching me. Its icy fingers brushing against my skin. My heart raced, and I could feel the panic rising in my throat. I had to get out. I had to escape. I turned and ran toward the only other escape, the window. I tore the curtains open, throwing them to the floor, and tried to open the window. But it wouldn't budge either. It was sealed shut, as if the world itself had decided I wasn't meant to leave. The air in the room was thick with the scent of something rotten. The breathing was everywhere now, surrounding me, closing in on me. I stumbled back toward the mirror, where I could see it. The reflection was no longer just a reflection. It was me, but not me. It was smiling. It was grinning, and its eyes, those empty, hollow eyes, stared back at me. I could see its hand reaching out from the mirror, its fingers stretching toward me. I stepped back, my legs giving way beneath me. I collapsed to the floor, and I screamed. But the scream didn't come from me. It came from the reflection. The thing in the mirror screamed, a bone-chilling sound that echoed through the room, rattling the walls. The sound was so loud, so deafening, that I thought my ears would bleed. I couldn't breathe. It wasn't just breathing anymore. It was laughing. The thing was laughing at me. And then, for a moment, the room went silent. For the first time in what felt like forever, the air around me was still. No more breath. No more sound. I thought I had imagined it. I thought the terror had finally broken me. But then, the mirror, it moved. It wasn't just an object anymore. It cracked, splitting down the center. And through the crack, I saw something. Something else. A figure, tall, thin, distorted. Its body was twisted, broken, like it had been stretched beyond its natural form. It had no face, no eyes, just a featureless expanse of skin. It reached out through the crack, and I could feel its fingers brushing against my shoulder. Cold, like ice. I screamed again, but no one would hear. The room began to fade away, the walls crumbling around me. And as I fell, I could feel the thing, pulling me into the mirror. The glass shattered, and I was gone. The world outside was quiet as it always had been, and the mirror, now whole, reflected nothing but the empty room. The room where the breathing would never stop. I woke up, or at least I thought I did. The first thing I noticed was the silence. The kind of silence that feels wrong, like the world is holding its breath. I sat up slowly, trying to make sense of where I was. My hands touched the cold surface beneath me, smooth, slick, like glass. It felt unnatural. I looked around, but there was nothing. No walls, no furniture, no windows. Just endless blackness, stretching out in all directions. I was floating in a void. Panic set in. My breath quickened. I tried to speak, but my voice sounded muffled, as if the air itself was pressing against my words, trapping them before they could escape. Then, I felt it. A chill running down my spine. The familiar sensation of something behind me, something watching. I turned, but there was nothing. Just the oppressive blackness. I tried to move, to find some way out, but my legs wouldn't cooperate. They were heavy, as if weighed down by something I couldn't see. I tried to scream again, but the sound was swallowed by the silence. It was then that I saw it. The mirror. At first, it was just a crack in the air, barely noticeable. But then, it widened and the reflection began to form. Not my reflection, but something else. It was the thing, the same twisted, faceless figure from before. Its body was the same distorted shape, like it was trying to force itself through the crack in the mirror, but it couldn't quite fit. The thing in the mirror moved, and so did I. My reflection mirrored every move I made, but the thing in the mirror didn't follow. It stayed where it was, its hand reaching out toward me, its fingers pressing against the surface of the mirror, as if trying to pull itself free. I could feel it, that coldness, that emptiness creeping into my chest, filling my lungs with ice. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. The thing in the mirror was reaching for me, and I could feel its touch, cold and suffocating, curling around my neck. I tried to scream again, but this time it wasn't me screaming. It was the thing in the mirror. Its mouth stretched wide, its grin widening to an impossible size. It laughed, a laugh that made my skin crawl, a laugh that rattled the very air around me. And then, everything went black. I don't know how long it's been. Time no longer has any meaning here. I'm trapped. Trapped in the mirror, or maybe it's the mirror that's trapped in me. I don't know anymore. The breathing is constant now. It's all I can hear. It's behind me, beside me, all around me. I can't escape it. I can't escape it. And when I look into the mirror now, I see nothing. No reflection. Just the darkness. The laughter never stops. Have you ever felt the strange pull of an object, a sense that it calls to you? That it's not just something you're looking at, but something you're meant to have? I never believed in superstitions, but that was before I visited the exhibition. It all started on a quiet Saturday afternoon. I had nothing better to do, so I wandered into the local museum. There was a new exhibit opening that afternoon, something about ancient artifacts and forgotten civilizations. I wasn't expecting much, but the museum had a certain charm, and it was free, so why not? The room where the exhibit was held had a dark, musty smell, like old wood and dust. The lights flickered above, casting long, eerie shadows across the room. There were rows of glass cases, each holding something from another time, each seeming to hold a secret. I walked from one to the next, admiring the craftsmanship of long-forgotten cultures. There were golden statues, pieces of pottery, and intricate weapons, each piece a testament to the skills of the ancient world. But then I saw it. In the far corner of the room, there was a glass case that seemed to pulse with an energy of its own. It wasn't particularly large or impressive, just an old, weathered book bound in cracked leather. But something about it caught my attention. My heart skipped a beat, and I felt that strange pull, like the book was calling me. I leaned in closer, studying the faded symbols etched into the cover. I don't know how long I stood there, transfixed by it. The other visitors moved past me, chatting among themselves, unaware of what I was feeling. But I couldn't tear my eyes away. There was something familiar about that book, as if I had seen it before in a dream, or perhaps in another life. I reached out, my fingers just brushing the glass. That's when I felt it. A faint, whispering sound behind me. I turned quickly, but no one was there. Just the cold, sterile air of the museum. I chalked it up to nerves. After all, I'd been staring at that book for far too long. But the feeling didn't go away. I tried to shake off the unease, but it lingered. I moved to the next case, trying to distract myself, but that book kept drawing my attention like a magnet. I found myself walking back to it, unable to resist. This time, I didn't just look, I pressed my hand against the glass, feeling the cold surface beneath my palm. The whispering grew louder, clearer now, as if someone, or something, was trying to communicate with me. The sound seemed to come from the book itself, growing louder with every passing second. I could almost hear words, but they were distant and muffled. My heart pounded in my chest. I glanced around again. The room was empty. It was just me and the book. The whispering stopped abruptly, replaced by a heavy, suffocating silence. And then I saw it. The book was moving. The edges of the pages fluttered, as if caught in a breeze, but there was no wind. The cover twitched as if something inside was alive, something that wanted out. My breath caught in my throat. This couldn't be real. I had to be imagining things. But then, I heard it again, the sound of something shifting in the glass case. It was as if the book was trying to escape, trying to break free. I backed away slowly, my mind racing. What was happening? What was going on? And that's when I noticed something else. The other objects in the room. The golden statues. The weapons. The pottery. They were all different now. Their shapes seemed to distort, their details shifting and changing like they were alive. I could feel their eyes on me, staring from within the glass cases. I could almost hear their faint whispers, their silent pleas. They were all calling to me, each one with a voice of its own. I needed to get out. Now. But as I turned to leave, the door to the exhibit slammed shut with a deafening bang. I rushed to the door, tugging at the handle, but it wouldn't budge. Panic set in. I banged on the glass, shouting for help, but the only sound that echoed back was the whispering, growing louder and more frantic. Then, the book moved again. It leapt from its case, crashing to the floor with a sickening thud. The room seemed to tremble around me, the air thick with an unnatural energy. I stumbled back, tripping over my own feet, but I couldn't look away. The book opened, and I saw them. Faces. Twisted, contorted faces. Faces of people long dead. They stared at me from the pages, their eyes wide with fear, their mouths stretched in silent screams. I could hear their voices now, clear and sharp in my mind. "Take it," they whispered. "Take it. You must take it." I tried to shut my eyes, to block it out, but the whispers were inside my head now. The room spun around me. The artifacts in the cases began to move, their shadows stretching out toward me like hands reaching for my soul. I had to escape. I had to get away from them. But there was no way out. And that was when I realized the exhibition wasn't just a collection of artifacts. It was a trap. A trap that lured people like me in, drawing them to the objects that called to them one by one. I wasn't just a visitor anymore. I had become part of the exhibit. The door finally opened. But when I stepped into the hallway, I didn't feel relief. The museum was empty. There were no more visitors. No more staff. Just me. And the whispers still echoing in my mind. I looked down at my hands. They were covered in dust, streaked with something dark and sticky. I turned slowly, looking back at the exhibit. The doors were wide open now, inviting me back inside. I don't know how long I stood there. I don't know if I will ever leave. But I know one thing for sure. The artifacts aren't just objects. They are alive. And they want me. I should have left. I knew it. The moment I stepped out of that room, I should have walked straight to the exit. I should have ignored the whispers that seemed to linger in my ears, ignored the strange pull toward that exhibit. But I didn't. I kept thinking about the book, the one that moved, the one that seemed so familiar. It was as if it held some kind of secret, something I needed to understand. The eerie whispers from the pages echoed in my mind, as if they were calling to me. Take it. Take it. It wasn't just a voice in my head, it felt real, like something or someone was speaking directly to me. I tried to shake it off as I walked down the museum's long, empty hallways. But no matter how far I went, I couldn't get the feeling out of my chest. The air seemed colder now. The hum of the fluorescent lights above sounded like a drone, suffocating, filling the silence around me with an unnatural tension. As I passed the other exhibits, my eyes kept flickering back toward that room. The room that held the book. The book that felt like it was waiting for me. And that was when I felt it again, the weight of the air behind me, the sensation that someone or something was watching me. I turned quickly, but no one was there. Just the empty, lifeless halls of the museum. I shook my head. It had to be my imagination. I had spent too much time in that exhibit. The whispers were just the remnants of a strange experience, a lingering feeling that I couldn't explain. It would wear off. But when I walked past a nearby display case, I saw it. The golden statue, the one I had glanced at earlier, had changed. Its eyes, glassy and fixed before, were now focused directly on me, as if they followed my every movement. The smile on the figure's face had shifted too, twisting into something almost predatory. I froze. For a moment, I thought I saw it move. I blinked, and the eyes were back to their original, lifeless state. The smile was gone. I stepped back, my pulse quickening. This wasn't normal. I hurried out of the hallway, into the main atrium of the museum. I needed air. I needed to get out of there. But as I reached the exit doors, I heard it again. That whisper. Low, and just at the edge of hearing. It wasn't the book's voice this time. It was coming from behind me. I spun around, but the hall was empty, as it should be. No one was there. The air felt heavier now, suffocating. I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself. This couldn't be happening. I looked back at the exhibit doors. They were wide open. Something inside me, some dark curiosity, urged me to return. I stepped toward the doors without thinking, my feet moving on their own. I was drawn back to it, to the room, to the book. The closer I got, the stronger the pull became. And when I crossed the threshold, I froze. The exhibit was not as it had been. The glass cases that had once held their artifacts now stood open. Empty. There was no sign of the book, no sign of anything that had been in the room. It was as if everything had been removed. But I could still hear the whispers. Louder now. Clearer. Take it, they said. Take it. It's yours now. I stepped forward, my heart pounding in my chest. Where was everything? Where was the book? And then I saw it. The book, lying in the middle of the floor. The cover was open. Pages fluttering as if caught in the wind. But there was no wind. There was no reason for it to move. I reached out, trembling, and stopped just before my fingers touched the book. The moment I did, the temperature in the room dropped. My breath fogged in the cold air, and the whispers grew louder, frantic. I could hear them more distinctly now. It wasn't just one voice, it was a chorus. The walls of the room began to close in around me. I could feel the eyes of the objects, no, the artifacts, on me. They were alive now, their shapes shifting and twisting within their empty cases. I could see figures moving in the shadows, flickering just out of the corner of my eye. I backed away from the book, my pulse racing, but the door that had been opened just moments ago slammed shut with a deafening noise. I tried the handle, but it wouldn't budge. The room was locked. Trapped. The whispers were getting louder and possibly louder. I felt them pushing against my mind, against my thoughts, forcing themselves into my consciousness. The figures in the shadows, there were more now, were approaching. I could hear their footsteps. Not real footsteps, no. They were the sound of something dragging itself across the floor, slow and deliberate. I turned and tried to make a run for it, but something caught my leg, holding me back. I stumbled, falling to the floor, my hands scraping against the cold tile. I looked down. There were shadows, dark, swirling shadows, wrapping themselves around my ankles, pulling me closer to the book. I could feel the weight of the objects now. The statues, the pottery, the weapons, they were all there, each one closer than I remembered. I could hear them breathing, their hollow forms whispering in the darkness, calling me to them. I tried to scream, but no sound came. My throat was tight, constricted by the suffocating air. The walls of the museum were closing in on me, and the floor beneath me felt like it was shifting. And then, as I looked toward the book one last time, I saw it. The faces. Those twisted, contorted faces staring at me from the pages. They were screaming now, their mouths open wide, their eyes wide with terror. They weren't just trapped in the book. They were watching me. They were calling to me. And I knew that once I took it, I would never leave. I don't remember how I got out of that room. One moment, I was on the floor, tangled in the shadows, and the next, I was running, my heart hammering in my chest as I pounded against the door. The whispers had turned into screams, muffled but relentless, as if the room itself was alive and angry that I dared to escape. But escape I did, throwing myself into the empty hallway, gasping for air. I slammed the door behind me and leaned against it, my breath ragged, my mind reeling. It took me a moment to gather my bearings, to remind myself that I was still in the museum, still in the same place I had been just moments ago. But everything had changed. I could feel it, an oppressive weight in the air, as if something was following me, something unseen. I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see a figure emerging from the shadows. But the hallway was empty, just as it should be. The museum was quiet now, too quiet. I forced myself to move, my legs shaking as I took a few hesitant steps forward. The voices from the book still echoed in my mind, their demands relentless. Take it. Take it. It's yours. I shook my head, trying to push the thoughts away. It was all in my mind. This couldn't be real. No, it had to be some sort of trick, some strange psychological effect brought on by being in that room for too long. I just needed to leave. I needed to get out, and everything would be fine. But as I made my way down the hallway, I noticed something. The walls seemed different. The paintings that had once been there now had odd, distorted shapes. They weren't portraits or landscapes anymore. They were grotesque images, twisted figures with eyes too large, mouths too wide. And the floor felt uneven beneath my feet, as if it were warping, shifting under my weight. I tried to ignore it. It was all in my head. It had to be. But then I heard it again, the unmistakable sound of breathing. Soft at first, almost imperceptible. I froze. It wasn't my own breath. No, this was different. It was behind me. I spun around, but the hallway was still empty. I took another step, and the sound grew louder, closer. It was getting harder to breathe, the air growing thicker and colder. I could feel the weight of something behind me, something that wasn't just following me, but watching me. The footsteps came next, slow, deliberate, dragging across the floor. I could hear them getting closer. Panic flooded through me as I broke into a sprint, running down the hallway, my heart pounding in my chest. The noise behind me was growing louder, faster, and I knew whatever it was gaining on me. I turned a corner and stumbled into another gallery. This one was darker, lit only by dim, flickering lights that cast long shadows on the walls. I didn't care. I just needed to get away, to find a way out. But then I stopped. The air in this room was different. Heavier. As I looked around, I saw something, or someone, in the far corner. A figure, standing perfectly still. My breath caught in my throat. It was a man. At least, it looked like one. But his skin was pale, too pale, and his eyes were wide open, unblinking. His mouth was slightly agape, as if he were about to speak. But he didn't move. He didn't make a sound. I wanted to run, to turn around and escape, but I couldn't. I was rooted to the spot, staring at him. Something in his eyes, the way they stared back at me, made my blood run cold. The figure took a slow, deliberate step forward, and I flinched. It was as if he was being dragged by invisible strings, each movement jerky and unnatural. Take it. The whisper came again, this time more forceful, more demanding. It's yours. I turned away from the figure, my body trembling, but as I moved, I realized the room wasn't the same anymore. The walls were closing in, the ceiling lowering. The exit I had seen just moments ago was gone, replaced by more darkness, more twisting shadows. I ran, blindly, pushing through the shifting maze of exhibits, the whispers following me. Take it. Take it. It was only when I crashed into the display case that I stopped. The glass shattered under my hands, and I stumbled back, staring in horror at the object it had contained. It was a mask. A beautiful mask, crafted with intricate designs, dark and gleaming. But the eyes, they were hollow, black, as if they were waiting for something. A familiar weight in my chest pressed down on me. It was the mask. It had been there all along, but now it was calling to me. I reached for it, unable to stop myself. The moment my fingers touched the cold surface, a sharp pain shot through my chest. My vision blurred, and the whispers grew louder, drowning out everything else. My body was shaking, trembling as the room spun around me. And then, I heard it. A voice, clear and unmistakable. You belong to us now. The room seemed to collapse around me, the walls tightening, suffocating me. My breath came in shallow gasps as the shadows closed in, and the mask, now in my hands, felt heavier. Take it. It wasn't a choice anymore. It was too late. I woke up on the cold, hard floor, gasping for air, my heart pounding as if it had just been wrenched from my chest. The pain in my hand where I had been holding the mask was still sharp, as though something had torn into my flesh. I looked down, expecting to see blood, but there was nothing, just pale skin and the lingering chill of the room. I tried to push myself up, but my body felt heavy, as though it were no longer mine to command. My fingers trembled, my mind still foggy from the overwhelming sensations that had assaulted me only moments before. The mask. I glanced at the display case where it had been, but it was gone. The whispers were gone too. The room, which had seemed alive with threat just seconds ago, was now eerily quiet. But the silence was unnerving. It felt wrong. Too still. I rubbed my temples, trying to focus, trying to remember how I had gotten here. Hadn't I been running? Hadn't I heard footsteps? Felt the presence of something close behind me? I stood shakily, my legs buckling under my weight as I finally managed to right myself. The gallery around me had returned to its original, almost sterile, appearance. The paintings were in place, the artifacts were behind glass, perfectly arranged as if nothing had changed. But something was wrong. It was all wrong. The air smelled different, heavier, as if the very walls were breathing with me. I could feel it, the oppressive weight pressing on me from all sides. There was no escape, not really. No matter where I turned, the presence was there, inside the museum, inside my mind, waiting. I stumbled toward the exit, but as I walked, I noticed something strange. The hallway seemed to stretch out before me, endless. The doors I had passed earlier were now gone, replaced with walls that had never been there before. The air had shifted, growing colder, and the shadows seemed to grow longer with each step I took. I couldn't escape. There was nowhere to go. I reached for the door handle, but it wouldn't budge. Panic crept in as I shook the door, slamming my body against it. But it wouldn't open. The room behind me, the gallery I had been in, was empty now, completely silent. Only the faint hum of the lights overhead remained. The whispers began again, softer this time, almost like a hum in the back of my mind. But they were no longer words. They were feelings. Desire. Hunger. Something deep inside me stirred in response. I turned around, slowly, and that's when I saw it. A figure emerged from the shadows. At first, it was just a vague outline, but as it stepped into the light, I could see it clearly. It was a man, tall and thin, his features sharp and hollow, as though his face had been drained of life. His eyes were dark voids, impossible to read, and his mouth was twisted into a grin that made my skin crawl. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. The look in his eyes said everything. He was here for something. He was here for me. The moment I saw him, I knew. It wasn't just a person. He was part of it, part of whatever curse had taken root in this place. I had never been meant to leave. The mask, the whispers, they had led me here. To this moment. To this figure. I backed away, my heart racing as I stumbled backwards. But with every step I took, he followed. It wasn't even a walk. He glided, his movements unnatural, smooth, as if he were part of the shadows themselves. Take it. The voice came from all around me now, the whispers enveloping me like a thick fog. It was not just the figure speaking, it was everything. The walls, the floor, the air itself. It was all calling to me. The museum had become something else, something that no longer resembled the place I had walked into just hours before. The walls now seemed to pulse, as if they were alive. The floor had become uneven, warped beneath my feet. I could feel the weight of the mask still pressing into my palm, an anchor to something dark, something ancient. And then I realized something worse. The mask was no longer in my hand. It was on my face. I reached up, my fingers trembling as they brushed against the cold surface. The mask had settled onto me without my realizing it, its shape melding with my skin. It felt like it belonged there, like it had always belonged there. No, no, I whispered, trying to rip it off, but it wouldn't budge. It was a part of me now. The figure was closer now, so close I could feel his cold breath on my neck. His dark eyes locked onto mine, and I could feel his intentions seep into my mind, his hunger consuming me. His smile widened, his grin stretching impossibly wide. You belong to us now, he said, his voice low and guttural. The shadows around me closed in tighter, wrapping around me like chains. The whispers became screams, deafening in their intensity, drowning me, suffocating me. And I knew, deep down, that I was no longer myself. The mask had claimed me, and whatever lay beyond it had claimed my soul. I had become a part of the exhibit. A part of the dead. In the dark corners of the museum, I could see the others. Faces, eyes, all watching me, silent, still, trapped in their own cursed existence. And as I looked into their hollow, lifeless eyes, I understood. They, too, had been claimed by the objects in this place. I had become one of them. And the museum, with all its cursed exhibits, would never let me leave. I could feel the weight of the mask pressing against my face, its cold surface more suffocating with each passing second. I couldn't tear it off. It was like it had grown into my very skin. The presence of the figure behind me was overwhelming. His shadow enveloped me, merging with the darkness of the room. You're part of the collection now, the voice whispered again, but this time it wasn't just him speaking. It was everywhere, the walls, the floor, the air itself, all whispering the same terrible truth. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body refused to obey. The mask seemed to drain me of every ounce of strength, leaving me numb and paralyzed. The figure stepped closer, his grin widening. I could hear the soft scrape of his feet on the floor, but it wasn't a sound. It was a sensation, like the very air was shifting, thickening, becoming one with him. Don't worry, he said, his voice oozing with something ancient, something cruel. You'll become part of the story. the story of the exhibition of the dead. I tried to speak, to protest, but no words came out. I was trapped in a silent scream, my mind racing, trying to make sense of what was happening. How could this be real? Was I hallucinating? But the pain, the heaviness of the mask, the pressure in my chest, it was all too real. I felt a sudden surge of panic, the instinct to fight pushing through the fog of fear. My hands trembled as I reached for the mask again, trying desperately to pull it off. But it was no use. It had fused with my skin, and my fingers slid helplessly over its smooth surface. And then, I saw them. Faces. Eyes. Dozens of them. All staring at me from the corners of the room, from the walls, from the very shadows themselves. They weren't alive, not in the way I had once known. They were frozen, paralyzed in time, their eyes wide with terror, their mouths open in eternal screams. I recognized some of them. People from my past. Friends, acquaintances, faces I had once known, now lost, now part of this collection of horrors. And their eyes begged for release. The figure behind me laughed softly, the sound chilling and hollow. They were once like you, he said, thinking they could escape. But they belong to the museum now, just like you. I staggered back, but my body felt as if it were trapped in place, glued to the floor by some invisible force. I wanted to run, to escape, but the museum was changing around me. The walls shifted, warped, expanding and contracting as if the building itself was alive, breathing, growing. I could feel the presence of something else, something vast, stretching beyond the confines of the room. It was as if the museum itself were hungry, consuming everything in its path, pulling in the souls of those who had been foolish enough to enter. And now, I was just another part of it, another piece of the twisted collection. The whispers grew louder, no longer just words, but feelings, emotions flooding my mind. Fear, regret, longing. I could hear their voices, the voices of the others who had been trapped here, their souls bound to the cursed objects. They were crying out for release, but it was too late. There was no escape. Let go, the figure murmured. Let it take you. I closed my eyes, the pressure of the mask becoming unbearable, suffocating me. The darkness around me seemed to close in, the walls pressing in tighter, the shadows thickening until they consumed everything. And then, there was nothing. No sound. No light. No feeling. I don't know how long I stood there, or perhaps I wasn't standing at all. Time seemed to stop, or maybe it never existed in the first place. The world around me was gone, swallowed up by the same darkness that had claimed me. I was alone, but not truly alone. The faces, those other souls, remained with me, watching me from the depths of my mind. They were here, with me. Part of me. And I realized with a sickening certainty that I would never leave. The museum had claimed me, just as it had claimed them. I was a part of the display now, just another object in a twisted exhibition. Forever. I had become one of the dead. Forever frozen in time, my face obscured by the cursed mask, my soul lost in the void. And as the darkness consumed me entirely, I heard it. A faint, distant whisper, barely audible but unmistakable. You will never be forgotten. Thank you for making our stories part of your relaxation time. We hope they brought you a sense of peace and transported you to a world of fantasy and mystery. If you enjoyed the stories, feel free to leave us a review. Your feedback inspires us and helps us make the content even better. Now, unwind to the calming sounds of rain and thunderstorms, which will continue to set a tranquil mood. Let these sounds carry you gently into the realm of dreams. Don't forget to like our page if you haven't yet. Wishing you a restful night's sleep. Relax, rest well, and good night.